What if, on April 2nd, 1944, someone had been standing alone on a ridge in a corner of the world that almost no one in London or Tokyo or Delhi had ever heard of, and had chosen to record not the sound of war, but the sound of peace before it arrived? What would they have heard? There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the Naga Hills just before the monsoon breaks fully. It is not the silence of emptiness, rather, it is the silence of a landscape holding its breath. Mist rises from the valleys in the pre-dawn hours, moving slowly upward like something conscious and deliberate, wrapping itself around the high ridges where the pine trees stand in dark clusters. The air carries the weight of moisture and growth. The smell of damp earth and the green abundance that comes from soil that has known centuries of rain. If you had been there, if you had somehow found yourself standing on Kohima Ridge, in those final quiet hours before everything changed, you would have noticed that the mist does not simply hide what lies below. It transforms it. The valley floor vanishes entirely, and the ridge becomes an island, suspended between earth and sky, untethered from ordinary geography. The season was approaching that threshold when the northeast monsoon finally releases its grip, and the southwest wind begins to turn the world wet. The pine needles, when you brushed past them, released their sharp, clean scent into air that was already dense with moisture. Birdsong carried strangely through the mist. A single note would travel farther than it should, then seem to hang suspended before fading away. There were no sounds of machinery, no distant thunder of truck engines, no voices raised in alarm or preparation, just the occasional shift of stone, the whisper of vegetation in the slight breeze that moved along the high ground, and the subtle dripping of condensation from the trees. The British garrison at Kohima, in those final hours before the Japanese arrived, was not large. A few hundred soldiers, scattered across positions they had only recently begun to fortify. Most of them were not on high alert. Why should they have been? The Japanese were hundreds of miles away, engaged in their monumental offensive further south, aimed at capturing Imphal. Kohima was, by all rational assessment, too remote, too difficult to reach, too insignificant to warrant a major assault. The ridge itself was modest in its proportions. Not a dramatic peak, but rather a gentle rise in terrain that commanded views of the valleys and paths around it. On a clear day, which was rare during this season, you could see for considerable distances, but in this particular dawn, the mist allowed you to see almost nothing at all. What you would have felt, had you been standing there, was a peculiar combination of peace and vulnerability. The landscape itself seemed beautiful, austere and beautiful in the way that high, mist-covered places are beautiful. There was nothing threatening visible. The Japanese were still several days away, struggling through the same hills from a different direction, their soldiers dying quietly of dysentery and exhaustion even before they encountered a single British bullet. The garrison was unaware of the approaching storm, but the ridge was waiting. The stones, the trees, the very air itself seemed to be waiting for something. If you have ever wondered what one of the most forgotten and yet most brutal battles of the entire Pacific War looked like in its final moment of peace, if you have ever asked yourself why a battle that was as desperate and as consequential as anything that happened in Europe somehow faded from memory while other conflicts remained vivid, if those questions have ever crossed your mind, then what you are about to hear might matter to you. If you find yourself drawn to histories that challenge what we think we know, to stories from places that the maps of our minds often leave blank, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We return regularly to moments like this one, to the overlooked corners of history, where the most extraordinary human stories unfold in near silence. But let us return now to that ridge at first light, as the mist begins to thin in places and burn away in others. Let us inhabit that stillness for just a moment longer, because this particular silence was about to be broken by events that would echo far beyond the Naga Hills, events that would eventually be remembered, by those who survived them, as something approaching the urban horror of Stalingrad. Except that Stalingrad was fought in the streets and basements of a city, while this battle would be fought for control of a ridge, a tennis court, a small cluster of buildings, and a handful of defensive positions scattered across terrain that was itself as much an enemy as any soldier. The Naga Hills rise abruptly from the Assamese plains, and they are unlike much else in the geography of South Asia. They are old, heavily forested, laced with streams and ravines, and they belong to a people who had their own cultures, their own village structures, their own histories that stretched back long before the British arrived with maps and administrators. The Nagas themselves, in the month of April, would have been familiar with many of these ridges and valleys as places to forage, to hunt, to move between their villages. The seasons had their own rhythms here. The mist that now lay so thickly across Kohima Ridge was a familiar companion, not an intrusion. What was about to intrude was something far more foreign, the collision of two distant empires, each with its own dreams of conquest, and each willing to contest this high ground with the lives of thousands of young men. The pine scent lingered in the mist. The dripping of water from the trees continued its soft percussion. In a few hours, the first Japanese patrols would make contact with British positions at the lower elevations. By evening, the encirclement would begin. But in this moment, in this false dawn that still held the peace of the night, the ridge was simply a ridge. The mist was simply mist. The silence was the silence of a world that did not yet know that it was about to become unforgettable. And yet, somewhere in the collective memory of the Second World War, this place has been nearly forgotten in the West. A battle so fierce, so intimate in its brutality, that those who fought it called it by a name that would echo through decades, the Stalingrad of the East. Have you ever wondered why some battles etch themselves into our consciousness, while others, equally devastating, slip quietly into the margins of history? The answer often lies not in the scale of the fighting, though the scale was immense, but in which stories were told first, and which voices were loudest in telling them. If you find yourself drawn to the untold corners of history, to those moments where empires collided in remote places, far from the headlines and Hollywood dramatizations, I hope you'll consider joining us as we explore these forgotten battles and the people who lived and died within them. We uncover stories like this one, the ones that shape the world but rarely make it into our schoolrooms, not because we've conquered our history, but because there's so much of it still waiting to be truly heard. Subscribe if you want to wander through these overlooked chapters with us, to sit with the weight of what happened in places like Kohima, long after the news cameras moved on. The battle itself, you see, was not one of urban devastation as Stalingrad had been, not a city reduced to rubble and fighting in the bones of buildings. Instead, imagine this, a ridge in the Naga Hills of northeast India, in what is now the state of Nagaland, rising to barely 4,000 feet above sea level. The fighting that would unfold there in the spring and early summer of 1944 would be waged across tea gardens and funeral grounds, through dense jungle, along narrow ridges where soldiers could see their enemies' faces, across distances measured in yards rather than kilometers. The casualty rate per square foot of ground would rival Stalingrad itself. The suffering would be every bit as absolute, and yet, for decades afterward, the world hardly knew its name. This was not a battle decided by grand strategy alone, though strategy was certainly at work. It was not a turning point announced to the world with fanfare and communiques. Rather, it was decided by hunger and thirst, by mud and disease, by the slow attrition of men broken down by disease and starvation to the point where they could barely lift their weapons. It was a battle where the jungle itself became as much an enemy as the soldiers facing each other across those contested heights, where the monsoon rains would transform the landscape into something barely navigable, where thousands would die not in moments of heroic combat, but in the slower, more terrible grip of dysentery, malaria, and the creeping exhaustion of a body pushed beyond every conceivable limit. To understand why Kohima matters, why it deserves to be spoken of in the same breath as the great sieges of history, we need first to understand what brought these armies to this particular ridge in the spring of 1944. We need to know who the Japanese thought they were fighting for, What drove them across hundreds of miles of jungle-clad mountains? We need to understand the dreams and delusions of empire that placed two armies in collision on a remote piece of the globe where the vast majority of the world's population had never heard the name. And perhaps most importantly, we need to understand the people who were already living there, the Naga peoples, who had called these hills home for generations before uniforms and artillery arrived to remake their world. The landscape itself is crucial to this story because Kohima was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a small administrative outpost, a tea-growing region, a place where the colonial machinery of the British Raj maintained a distant, light presence. The hills around it were steep and heavily forested, covered in dense rhododendron thickets and pine woods, the air thick with moisture even before the monsoon rains began to fall. The ridge where the battle would be fought is not some towering peak, but rather a modest elevation with a tennis court, a small garrison, a few government buildings, and the simple infrastructure of a colonial hill station. When the first Japanese soldiers began to encircle it in early April, they were closing a ring around what looked, on paper, like a very small and not particularly significant prize. And yet that small prize represented something vast. It lay directly on the path between the Japanese army and the city of Imphal, to the south and west, which had become the true objective of the Japanese offensive. Imphal was where the British had gathered supplies, where the administrative structures of their control over India were most concentrated, where the road to India itself seemed to lie open, or so the Japanese believed. Kohima, then, was not the destination but the obstacle. It was the place where the British could either be overwhelmed quickly, swept aside in the rush toward Imphal, or where they might make a stand. And it was in making that stand, against odds that seemed impossible, with supplies dwindling and relief uncertain, that the garrison and the reinforcements who came to their aid would create one of the most extraordinary episodes of the Pacific War. This is what we're truly after as we move deeper into the story, not just the facts of what happened, but the human experience of it. The texture of thirst so profound that soldiers in a tropical region, surrounded by jungle, would have killed for water. The strange intimacy of combat, where you could see your enemy's expression, where the fighting was conducted at ranges so close that hand grenades and bayonets became the primary weapons. The way in which ordinary men, shopkeepers from London, farmers from Punjab, hillsmen from the Gurkha regions, and peasant soldiers from rural Japan found themselves bound together in this particular place for this particular season, their fates intertwined in ways that would echo across the decades. The fog that rises from the Naga hills in the early morning has a particular quality to it. It settles into the valleys and clings to the ridges, muffling sound, reducing visibility to a few yards in all directions. In April of 1944, as Japanese soldiers began to arrive at the edges of the landscape surrounding Kohima, in small groups after weeks of march through the jungle, that fog would have been a kind of mercy, at least for a moment. It would have obscured the reality of what was about to occur. It would have been possible, in those dawn hours before the real fighting began, to imagine that this was still a place of natural beauty, untouched by war, a place where the most significant human activity was the tending of tea gardens and the movement of traders along established routes. That illusion would not last long. In the spring of 1944, as the war in Europe reached its crescendo and the Allies prepared for their assault on occupied France, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was engaged in a different kind of calculation, one born of desperation, audacity, and a gamble that would reshape the war in Asia in ways no one could fully predict. By that point, Japan had been steadily losing ground across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Island after island had fallen. American submarines prowled the seas, cutting supply lines. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, once so compelling to military planners in their maps and war rooms, was beginning to feel less like inevitable destiny and more like a fading mirage. Yet rather than retreat or consolidate, the Japanese military command made a choice that speaks to something fundamental about the psychology of losing. they decided to attack. Not to consolidate their position or defend what remained, but to seize the initiative one more time, to strike westward, to threaten the very heart of British India itself. The operation was given a code name, Yugo, Operation Yugo. It was, in the most essential sense, a race against time. Japanese strategists understood that they could not win a war of attrition against the combined industrial might of the Allies. But perhaps, they reasoned, they could achieve a decisive blow in Southeast Asia. If they could cut the supply lines flowing north into China, if they could strike deep into India itself and foment rebellion against the British Raj, they might yet alter the trajectory of the entire war. India, after all, was restless. The independence movement was gathering strength. There were those who believed that a Japanese presence, or the mere threat of one, could spark an uprising that would force Britain to withdraw resources from the larger war effort. It was a theory that appealed to a particular kind of thinking, bold, almost desperate, the sort of strategic reasoning that takes root when conventional means of winning no longer seem possible. The architect of this plan was General Hideki Tojo and his strategic advisors, though the actual execution would fall to the armies in Burma and Assam. The target was twofold, the towns of Imphal and Kohima. If you were to examine a map of northern Burma and Assam in 1944, these two names would have marked crucial nodes in the British supply network. Imphal, a larger garrison town with an airfield, lay in a broad valley in Manipur state. Kohima, smaller and more remote, sat perched on a ridge in the Naga Hills, serving as a vital junction and relay point for supplies moving toward China. Together, they represented the gateway. Take them both, the Japanese High Command believed, and the whole edifice of British authority in India would begin to crack. Or so the theory went. In reality, what would unfold would be something far more grinding and terrible than any theory could capture. The scale of the Japanese commitment was enormous. 3 full divisions would be deployed, the 15th, 31st, and 33rd Divisions, comprising roughly 80,000 men. They would need to march from central Burma, cross the dense and challenging terrain of the Chindwin River Valley, claw their way over the Naga Hills, one of the most unforgiving pieces of terrain on the Asian continent, and establish themselves in positions from which they could strike at Imphal and Kohima. The logistical challenge was staggering. Japanese supply lines, already stretched thin by Allied air superiority and submarine activity, would be stretched even further. The troops would be supplied initially from depots in Burma, but once they crossed into Indian territory, they would be expected to live off the land and off captured supplies. In some ways, this revealed a fatal flaw in the entire operation. Yugo was predicated on the assumption of swift, decisive victory. If the campaign bogged down into a prolonged siege or grinding attrition, the Japanese forces would find themselves in an increasingly untenable position, their supply lines broken, their troops far from home, with nowhere to retreat to but through the very terrain that had nearly killed them on the way in. Yet in the early months of 1944, this calculation seemed worth the risk. The Japanese commanders involved, particularly General Masaki Honda and General Renya Mutaguchi, who was orchestrating much of the tactical planning, believed that the British were weak in India. They believed that the garrison forces were scattered and unprepared. They believed that a sudden, coordinated strike would achieve surprise, and that this surprise would translate into victory before any relief force could arrive. These were the assumptions upon which Yugo was built, and to a certain degree, the assumptions were not unreasonable. The British forces in India were indeed spread thin. There had been no major Japanese offensive thrust toward India in the entire war. Military planning has often stumbled over the very human tendency to underestimate an enemy you've already begun to regard as beaten. What did the Japanese command know of the British 14th Army in India? What did they know of the Indian troops, the Gurkhas, the other units that would soon be called upon to defend this ridge in the clouds? The campaign began in March 1944. Japanese columns moved out from their bases in Burma, heading north and west toward their objectives. They moved through dense jungle and climbing terrain, pushed by the knowledge that every day mattered. Speed was supposed to be their greatest asset, the ability to strike before the British could reinforce or prepare adequate defenses. Behind the striking forces came support units, hospitals, and the long tail of any military campaign. Behind them, too, came the monsoon season, which would soon transform the entire landscape into a nightmare of mud, disease, and entropy. The Japanese soldiers who embarked on this journey were often young men, drawn from families and farms across Japan, carrying rifles and the weight of their nation's desperate gamble. Many of them believed in the righteousness of their cause. Many were simply doing what they had been ordered to do. Few, perhaps, could have imagined the scale of the ordeal that awaited them in the high hills of Nagaland, or the precise manner in which this particular campaign would come to embody the terminal decline of Japanese military power in Asia. But first, the armies had to reach the ridge. First, they had to cross the Chindwin. First, they had to ascend into the Naga Hills, and waiting for them there, still unprepared but beginning to sense what was coming, were the British garrison forces, the Indian soldiers, and a small mixed force that would soon find themselves defending a name, Kohima, that most of the world would eventually forget. The land itself that would soon become a crucible of war lay in the northeastern corner of India, where the Naga Hills rose like the spine of some ancient beast through the mists and monsoon clouds. These were not mountains of dramatic majesty, but rather a series of steep, densely forested ridges that seemed to roll endlessly into the haze, a landscape that had remained almost untouched by the wider world, inhabited for countless generations by peoples who had their own stories, their own rhythms, entirely separate from the ambitions of distant empires. The Naga Hills, you might say, had always belonged to themselves. The Naga peoples themselves were a confederation of distinct groups, each with their own language, their own customs, their own understanding of the world around them. To outsiders, whether British colonials or Indian officials, they often seemed inscrutable, fiercely independent, organized into village councils that made decisions by consensus rather than decree. They were skilled cultivators of the terraced hillsides, growing rice and other crops through methods refined over centuries. They were expert hunters, trackers, men and women who read the forest as others might read a book, who understood the calls of birds and the signs of weather changes written in subtle shifts of light and air. The villages themselves were built with a particular elegance, clusters of long houses constructed from wood and bamboo, their roofs pitched steeply to shed the torrential monsoon rains that arrived each year with almost mechanical regularity. And in those villages lived families whose names we will never fully know, whose daily concerns in early 1944 had nothing whatsoever to do with the wider war that was consuming the world. Mothers concerned themselves with their children, farmers tended to their fields, young people navigated the customs of courtship and marriage. Elders passed down stories of ancestors and warnings about the dangers of the forest. To be a Naga in the Naga Hills in that time was to live within a particular, coherent world, a world that had been disrupted, certainly, by British colonial rule and the slow imposition of external administrative structures, but a world that still retained much of its own integrity and autonomy. The villages of Kohima, Imphal, and the surrounding territories had endured as human settlements for centuries, their presence woven into the landscape as naturally as the ridges and valleys themselves. But the geography that had protected these peoples for so long, the very remoteness that had allowed them to maintain their distinct cultures and ways of living, would now become an object of intense strategic calculation. The Naga Hills stood directly in the path of competing imperial ambitions. For the British, controlling these hills meant maintaining their foothold in India and protecting the approaches to Assam and its vital tea plantations and oil fields. For the Japanese, these same hills represented a potential gateway, a high road that might lead to the conquest of India itself, to the weakening of British power across Asia, to the establishment of a new regional order under Japanese dominance. Neither empire had asked the Naga peoples what they thought of this arrangement. Neither empire particularly cared about the ancient autonomy of village councils or the integrity of agricultural calendars and cultural practices. Kohima itself was a modest administrative centre, a town that had grown up partly as a result of British colonial presence, perched on a ridge at roughly 5,000 feet above sea level. It was not grand or heavily fortified, more of a district headquarters, a place where colonial officials conducted the business of governance and where a small garrison was maintained to represent the order and power of distant empires. Around Kohima lay a patchwork of smaller settlements and villages, each with its own history and its own particular relationship to the land. The ridge on which Kohima sat commanded views across the surrounding valleys and hills, which meant, strategically speaking, that whoever held that ridge held an advantage in controlling movement through the region. This is almost always how empire works, you might observe. It looks at landscapes and sees not the homes of peoples and the accumulated memories of generations, but rather sees supply routes and sight lines and defensive positions. The forests that surrounded Kohima and the other villages of the region were thick with teak and pine, and countless varieties of vegetation suited to the subtropical climate. The undergrowth was dense, often nearly impenetrable, broken by streams and small rivers that cut through the valleys. During the dry season, these hills could be navigated, though with considerable difficulty. During the monsoon season, which typically began in June and lasted through September, the landscape transformed into something almost alien. Streams became torrents, exposed earth turned into slick mud. The very air became so saturated with moisture that it seemed impossible to draw a clean breath. It was in this landscape, these villages, this particular moment in early 1944, when the Naga peoples, many of whom had little knowledge of or interest in the larger war consuming other parts of the globe, would find themselves at the precise intersection of history's collision. The British presence in the region, while established through colonial rule, was still relatively light in terms of military infrastructure. There were no massive fortifications, no sprawling garrison cities. Instead, there was a kind of assumed permanence, mixed with a certain complacency, an assumption perhaps that the remoteness of the hills and the challenges of the terrain would serve as sufficient defense against any serious threat. The Naga villages, meanwhile, had begun to experience some of the indirect effects of war, even as the main conflict still seemed distant. Some young men had been recruited or conscripted into service with the British. Others had been pressed into service as porters and labourers for the military effort elsewhere in the theatre. A slow, almost imperceptible transformation was beginning in these hills, a gradual drawing in of the Naga peoples into the machinery of global war, even as they maintained the surface appearance of their ordinary lives. It is worth pausing, in the quietness of this moment before the storm, to consider what it might have been like to live in one of these villages, to have a stake in the land and its rhythms, to have ancestors buried in that soil and children who would one day inherit it, to have then that entire world suddenly intersected by the movements of military forces, by the logic of supply lines and defensive positions, by the requirements of empires locked in deadly contest. The Naga peoples would not, in many cases, choose which side to support or what role to play. They would be drawn into the war almost by gravity, by proximity and circumstance, rather than by conscious decision. Some would serve with the British, some would work for the Japanese, some would navigate the impossible space between, trying to protect their families and their villages, even as the machinery of war ground on around them. And through it all, the landscape itself, those ridges and forests and streams, would become not merely a setting for human drama, but a kind of third participant, shaping everything that was about to unfold. The Japanese 31st Division, under General Masafumi Sato, had been assembled with a singular, almost desperate purpose. It was the spring of 1944, and the war in Burma had begun to turn. Tokyo had wagered everything on a bold maneuver, not to hold ground they'd already claimed, but to seize the mountain valleys of India itself. Imphal and Kohima sat like two precious stones on the map, and if they could be taken quickly, if the British could be defeated decisively here in the hills, perhaps India's independence movement might rise up. Perhaps, in that chaos, Japan might hold the vast territories it needed to survive the widening war. It was a gamble. It was perhaps more than a gamble. It was necessity dressed as audacity. Sato was a man of the old samurai tradition, methodical and unbending, and he had been given orders that seemed almost impossible to carry out. He would lead his division, soldiers who had fought already in the jungles of Malaya and Burma, men lean and hardened by years of warfare, northward across the Chindwin River and then upward into the Naga Hills. The distance was perhaps 140 kilometers as the crow flew, but there were no roads worthy of the name. There were only footpaths, centuries-old routes carved by Naga traders and hunters, winding through terrain so steep and densely vegetated that a man could sometimes see no more than a few paces ahead. The Chindwin itself was no mere obstacle. It was a river swollen by the tail end of winter rains, brown and muscular in its flow, wide enough that crossing it would require improvisation and ingenuity. The Japanese engineers labored to construct boats and rafts from bamboo, and whatever wood they could fell in the riverside forests. Imagine the sound, the continuous ring of axes, the splash of timber being lashed together, the shouts of soldiers in a language foreign to those hills, the sense of an entire army being readied for something inevitable and terrible. The crossing itself, when it came in late March, was a feat of organization that military historians have rarely failed to acknowledge. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, their boots heavy with supplies they would carry on their backs, their rifles lashed to their bodies as they waded or swam the current. Some accounts suggest that the water was cold enough to steal the breath, though by then the jungle was warming toward the thick, humid heat of spring. Soldiers supported one another. The weak were helped by the stronger. There was a grim camaraderie in the crossing, the shared understanding that once the river lay behind them, there would be no retreat, no reinforcement, no supply line, except what they carried or what they could take from a hostile land. And then came the Naga Hills themselves. Here, the real ordeal began. The paths climbed with an almost vindictive steepness. A soldier encumbered with 40 kilograms of equipment, rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, water bottle, rations, would find himself ascending not for an hour or two, but for an entire day, sometimes more. The jungle itself seemed to resist them. Thorns caught at uniforms. Vines hung like ropes between the trees, and machetes had to be used constantly to clear passage. The canopy was so dense that midday could feel like twilight, and rain, when it came, did not simply fall from the sky. It seemed to drip from every leaf, to rise from the earth itself as mist, to soak through a man's skin, as if cloth and flesh were no barrier at all. What supplies the division carried had to be rationed almost from the start. The calculation was grim. If the march took longer than expected, if sickness slowed them, if the paths were worse than reconnaissance suggested, then men would arrive at Kohima hungry. Some officers understood this mathematics. Others perhaps did not wish to acknowledge it. The rice, carefully measured in bags, began to diminish at a rate faster than planned. Malaria, dysentery, and other fevers claimed soldiers even before any British bullet could. Men would wake in the darkness of the jungle floor, burning with fever, unable to continue, and there was no real option for evacuation. A soldier who could not walk simply fell behind. Whether he lived or died afterward was a matter of chance and whatever mercy his comrades could spare. Yet Sato's division pushed forward. There is something to contemplate in this. The simple, almost mechanical will of men to obey orders, to keep moving, to climb another 1,000 meters of elevation when every muscle screams for rest. Some were driven by martial honor. Some were driven by fear of their officers. Some perhaps had long ago ceased to think at all and simply moved because the soldier in front of them moved, because standing still meant being left behind in a place where standing still meant death. The division was not monolithic in its composition. There were seasoned combat troops who had served in China, who had fought across Malaya and into Burma. There were also newer soldiers, younger conscripts from Japanese cities and farms, men who had not heard gunfire in anger until recently. An old soldier could manage the privations of the jungle crossing. A young man, far from home and terrified, might find it utterly unbearable. The path itself made no distinction. It treated all feet equally. All lungs suffered equally in the thin mountain air. Around the middle of April, as the rains grew heavier, Sato's men began to emerge from the deepest jungle. They had climbed above much of the canopy. The views, on clear mornings, were extraordinarily beautiful, ridge after ridge rolling away toward the horizon, valleys filled with mist, the Naga villages appearing small and almost fragile on the hillsides. Some soldiers, one imagines, paused for a moment to take in the beauty despite the exhaustion, despite the ache in the legs and the hollow hunger in the stomach. Others would have seen only terrain they had to cross, enemy guns that might be waiting ahead, the next ridge that had to be climbed. Kohima itself was now close, perhaps only 2 or 3 days' march away. The British had observers on the higher ground, and they would have seen, or suspected, the movement of this large force through the hills. The sense of impending collision would have begun to settle over the landscape, that peculiar tension that precedes great violence, when both sides know something terrible is coming, but the exact hour remains unknown. The monsoon rains were beginning to arrive in earnest now. The tracks underfoot became treacherous mud, and still, Sato's division climbed toward the ridge, where a small British garrison, mostly unprepared and certainly undermanned, waited in the knowledge that they were about to be surrounded by an enemy that had crossed an ocean and a jungle to reach them. In a few days, the silence that had hung over Kohima for weeks would be shattered forever. As General Sato's columns pushed deeper into the hills, threading through valleys that had never known the sound of organized warfare, a different kind of preparation was unfolding on the ridge above Kohima town. Here, in the spring of 1944, the British garrison and their Indian Army colleagues were assembling something closer to a garrison than a fortress, a collection of scattered positions, hastily fortified, manned by troops who knew their numbers were thin but hoped their resolve might hold. The British command structure at Kohima had never anticipated a full siege. The place was conceived as an administrative outpost, a supply depot, a communications hub for the wider campaign in Burma and Assam. When the first serious intelligence reached headquarters about the scale of Japanese movement, there began a quiet scramble, not quite panic, but something edged with urgency, to strengthen what was essentially a skeleton force. Officers and men moved through the scattered positions on the ridge, filling sandbags, checking sightlines through the jungle, calculating how much water they could store, how many rations they might stretch. It was the work of soldiers preparing for something they hoped would never quite arrive, even as they moved with the efficiency of those who suspected it might. The garrison at its core consisted of perhaps 500 men, though that number would shift and swell as reinforcements trickled in during the final weeks before the assault. What made Kohima's defense distinctive was its composite character. The 4th Royal West Kent Regiment formed one nucleus. Their red and white regimental colours carried into jungle warfare thousands of miles from the English villages from which many of them had come. Alongside them were Indian Army units, the Assam Rifles, the Manipur State Forces, sepoys and sowars whose knowledge of the terrain and whose families lived in the foothills below were often more intimate than any map could convey. There were also Nepalese Gurkhas, soldiers whose reputation for ferocity and loyalty had already become legend by this point in the war. These units, thrown together by the machinery of military necessity rather than long association, were learning to work as one body in a place that had never seen such concentration of firepower or such deliberate construction of defense. The terrain itself presented an odd challenge. Kohima Ridge was not a fortress waiting to be occupied. It was a possession that had to be transformed into one. The elevation gave advantage, certainly. The ridge rose prominently above the surrounding landscape, granting those who held it sight across the valleys and approaches. But there was little natural protection. The topsoil was thin in places, hard-packed clay and stone beneath it. Digging trenches meant slow work with picks and shovels, men stripped to the waist in the humid afternoons, working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. Gradually, a network of positions emerged, machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, mortar pits situated where they could rain fire down on likely approach routes, rifle trenches connecting the key defensive points. The work had a sense of deliberation about it, the kind of slow, methodical preparation that speaks both of professional competence and of creeping dread. Among the officers preparing these defences was the garrison commander, a stocky British brigadier named Warren, whose demeanour was said to be one of quiet confidence, tempered by realism. Warren was not a flamboyant figure, but soldiers who served under him recalled his habit of walking the positions at dusk, speaking quietly with men about their ammunition supplies, their water, their morale. He was the kind of officer who seemed to understand that a garrison's strength lay not in speeches, but in the small accumulations of preparation. One more case of ammunition stored, one more water container buried and marked, one more traverse dug across a trench line to shield men from shrapnel. The preparations extended beyond the purely military. Supplies were a constant concern. The garrison established a small hospital area with medical orderlies preparing what supplies they had, knowing that if siege conditions developed, their medicine and instruments would need to serve far more casualties than the usual peacetime garrison would ever encounter. Food was inventoried carefully: rice, tinned vegetables, biscuits, sugar, portioned out with the calculation that if they were indeed cut off, these stores would need to sustain men on reduced rations for weeks. Water, always a critical concern in any siege, was another obsession. Tanks were filled from the small spring that served the position, and men were detailed to mark every container, to protect them from contamination, to understand where emergency supplies might come from if the main source was cut off by artillery fire or by the Japanese themselves. Perhaps most telling was the mood that settled over Kohima in those final weeks of April. Soldiers who were there later described it as a strange mixture of boredom and anticipation. The everyday routines of garrison life, parade, maintenance of equipment, occasional training exercises, continued. Men cleaned rifles, tested wireless sets, made what repairs they could to the ramshackle collection of buildings that formed the administrative quarter. But underneath this routine was an almost palpable sense of something approaching. Rumors circulated as they always do in military life, growing more specific and more alarming with each retelling. Japanese columns were definitely in the hills. They numbered 10,000, some said, or perhaps more. The Japanese were starving already, driven mad by hunger, which made them either less dangerous or far more so, depending on who was telling the story. The Indian soldiers and the local Naga men, who had been hired as porters and laborers, brought their own intelligence from below the ridge. Stories filtered up through the network of villages and tracks that crisscrossed the hills. The Japanese were indeed coming. They were moving with frightening speed despite the terrain. They had already clashed with British outposts further down the supply lines. The monsoon season was approaching, that great annual cycle that would soon render movement through the hills a matter of testing oneself against mud and swollen streams as much as against an enemy. The window of opportunity for a Japanese assault was narrowing. They would need to move soon, and Kohima, perched on the critical junction between Manipal and Dimapur, the supply centres that fed the entire British operation in Assam, had become the unavoidable target. As May arrived, bringing with it increasingly humid heat and occasional showers that hinted at the deluge to come, the garrison settled into their positions with the resignation of soldiers who have done all they can do. The defences were as ready as limited time and resources could make them. The men were trained and reasonably well supplied. Communications had been established so that if the worst came, they could call for air support, could coordinate with relief forces that were known to be forming somewhere in the lower elevations. Yet there remained a curious vulnerability to the position, a sense that what was being prepared here was less a fortress in any traditional sense, and more a line drawn in difficult terrain by men who would need to hold it with rifles and grenades and sheer determination. The British officers who looked out over the ridge toward the thickening jungle to the north could not have known precisely when the assault would come, but they knew with increasing certainty that it would come. It was perhaps this knowledge, held in common by officers and enlisted men, by Indian soldiers and Gurkhas, by the scattered support staff and the medical personnel, that created the peculiar atmosphere of those final days. Not despair, not quite, but an acknowledgement that the small garrison was about to be tested in ways that the pre-war training manuals could hardly have anticipated, and that everything they had prepared in these quiet weeks of April would soon be measured against the will and hunger and determination of an enemy that had already travelled through impossible terrain to reach them. By the first week of April in 1944, the men holding Kohima Ridge knew with absolute certainty that they were about to be surrounded. Not suspected, not feared, known. The runners had come down from the northern approaches. The Naga guides had brought word of the vast columns moving through the hills, and the sound of axes on timber, the Japanese cutting supply lines and building siege positions, had grown audible even at night. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows such knowledge, a heaviness in the air that precedes violence, and that silence had settled over the small garrison like the mist that clung to the ridge each morning. The Japanese 31st Division under General Sato had achieved something that seemed almost impossible in that terrain. They had moved nearly 5,000 soldiers, with artillery pieces, supplies and ammunition, across one of the most punishing stretches of jungle and mountain in Southeast Asia, and they had done it in a time frame that had shocked the British High Command. The Chindwin crossing had taken its toll. Some men had waded through water up to their shoulders, others had been swept downstream and lost entirely, and by the time the division had begun its final ascent toward Kohima, disease and exhaustion had already claimed as many soldiers as any bullet might have. Yet still they came, funneling through the narrow passes and emerging onto the high ground with a coordination that spoke to Sato's competence as a commander, even as his men were starving. What Sato had understood, with a clarity that had eluded some of the architects of the offensive, was that Kohima Ridge itself was the true objective, not merely as a military position, though it was certainly that, but as a choke point. The British were using the ridge as the hub of their supply line to the broader Assam Valley, and the road that ran beneath it connected Imphal to the rest of India. Control Kohima, and you throttle the entire northeastern front. Encircle it, and you create a prize that cannot be easily relieved. Starve it, and you acquire time. Time for the conquest of Imphal to the south. Time for whatever political arrangements might follow a dramatic Japanese victory on Indian soil. By April 8th, the first substantial Japanese elements had reached the high ground that overlooked the garrison from the north. What followed was not a sudden, dramatic assault, but something more deliberate and, in its own way, more terrifying. The Japanese began, methodically and with great care, to close the ring. They did not attack the ridge directly at first. Instead, they moved into the surrounding heights, establishing positions on the dominant terrain features, Aradura Spur to the northeast, Cathedral Peak, and the ridges beyond to the northwest, and, crucially, they moved to cut the road that ran through the valley below, the single lifeline along which supplies, and, if necessary, refugees might move. The British garrison at Kohima, when the siege began in earnest, numbered only around 2,000 men, though the exact figures are disputed by historians who note that units were constantly in flux, with reinforcements arriving even as the perimeter was being drawn tight. There were elements of the Assam Regiment, soldiers of the Sikh Regiment, companies of the Gurkhas whose presence would prove, in the weeks ahead, to be something close to legendary. There were administrative personnel, wounded men from earlier engagements who could still carry a rifle, officers and non-commissioned officers who understood that they were about to live through something for which no amount of peacetime training could have prepared them. There were also the Naga people themselves, some serving as porters, others as guides, still others simply trying to understand why their hills, their villages, their temples and farms, had suddenly become the pivot point of an empire's war. The experience of being encircled is not something that can be easily conveyed to someone who has never endured it. It is not merely a matter of tactical disadvantage, though it is certainly that. It is a psychological closing off, a severing of the sense of escape or relief, or simply the knowledge that help might arrive from any direction at any moment. The men on Kohima Ridge, as they dug in during those first few days of April, knew that they were now alone, in a way that is almost incomprehensible to those of us living in a world of constant communication and distant rescue. They had no certainty that reinforcements were coming. They could not know with any precision how many Japanese soldiers surrounded them, or whether those soldiers were poorly supplied, or, conversely, well provisioned for a siege. The radio could relay messages, but radio signals could be intercepted, and there was always the possibility that information transmitted into the void would simply disappear. The tactical picture, viewed from the British command post on the ridge, was one of progressive isolation. The main road that had connected Kohima to the south was cut. The northern approaches, through which the expected relief column from the 2nd Division would have to advance, became increasingly contested. The high ground surrounding the garrison, those crucial ridgelines and spurs that any military student could have identified as the keys to controlling the position, was slipping, piece by piece, into Japanese hands. Where, only days earlier, British patrols had been able to move relatively freely through the surrounding jungle, there now existed an invisible boundary beyond which movement meant encountering Japanese outposts, Japanese machine gun positions, Japanese soldiers who had been preparing for this engagement since they had crossed the Chindwin weeks earlier. By April 10th, the siege had become complete. The Japanese had not stormed the ridge. They had not attempted, at least not yet, any of the dramatic frontal assaults that might have broken the garrison through sheer weight of numbers. Instead, they had simply surrounded it, cutting it off from the wider world, and in doing so, they had created a situation in which the garrison's own resources, its ammunition, its food, its water, its ability to treat the wounded, became the true enemy. Time, in such circumstances, works against the smaller force. Every day that passed meant fewer rations, more men becoming ill or weak, less ammunition available for the defense of an increasingly compressed perimeter. The ridge itself, when viewed from above, or in the few maps that existed at the time, appeared as a relatively small feature in the vast landscape of the Naga Hills. It could be walked from one end to the other in perhaps 30 minutes, depending on the exact route one took and the density of the undergrowth. Yet this small piece of high ground, this seemingly insignificant ridge jutting upward from the surrounding valleys, had become the entire world for 2,000 British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers. It was their fortress, their home, their grave. And encircling it, in positions that grew more substantial and more heavily fortified with each passing night, were somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Japanese soldiers who had crossed mountains and rivers and jungle to reach this place, and who were now prepared to wait, to starve out their enemy, to grind away at the garrison until it could resist no longer. The silence on the ridge, that heavy, waiting silence that had descended a few days earlier, had transformed into something else entirely by the moment the encirclement became complete. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a trap that had been sprung, of a door that had closed with terrible finality, of a beginning that everyone understood would, sooner or later, require an ending. Once the encirclement had tightened and the Japanese forces had drawn their perimeter around the ridge, the British and Indian garrison faced a peculiar and crushing reality. They were sealed into a space no larger than a few hundred yards across, with supply lines cut and the rain beginning to come in heavier sheets as the monsoon season approached. What had been a military position became, quite suddenly, a place of profound scarcity, where every ounce of water, every handful of rice, and every cartridge of ammunition had to be accounted for with a precision that occupied the waking mind almost as completely as fear did. The ridge itself offered little comfort. Trenches were shallow, dug hastily into the rocky soil, and as the rains accumulated, they became channels for mud and standing water. Soldiers learned to sandbag their positions with whatever materials came to hand: empty ammunition boxes, torn ground sheets, even earth-packed ration tins. The defensive works were never what a soldier might call adequate. They were what men could make in the hours between bombardments and attacks. There was a rhythm to this construction, a kind of meditation in desperation, where hands and backs became the primary tool, where the act of digging itself became a statement of defiance, even when you knew the hole you were making might be the last shelter you ever knew. But it was thirst that emerged as perhaps the most insidious enemy of all. Water, which runs abundantly from the Naga Hills during the monsoon, somehow became impossibly scarce once the fighting began. The Japanese controlled the approaches to the water sources, and every attempt to draw water had to be covered by fire, had to be swift, had to gamble with lives. Men rationed themselves to what could be captured in containers and mess tins from the intermittent rains, and during the dry stretches between storms, thirst became a constant, gnawing presence. It was not romantic or heroic, it was simply exhausting. A soldier's lips cracked. His tongue felt thick and foreign in his mouth. He could taste only dust and the iron of old blood from his own gums. The food situation was no gentler. The siege had begun with stores designed to sustain a much smaller garrison for a much shorter period. As days accumulated into weeks, the quartermaster's calculations grew darker. Rations were cut progressively. What had been a tin of bully beef served to 3 men became a serving for 5. The rice allowance diminished. Hard biscuits, which had already developed the consistency of concrete, became thinner slices. Many soldiers would later recall that they spent much of their waking time thinking about food, not in the sentimental, letter-home way that one imagines, but in a hollow, purely physical way. What does hunger do to the mind after days have become weeks? It narrows it, it simplifies it. It becomes difficult to think of much beyond the next meal, or the meal after that. Perhaps there is something in this detail worth sitting with for a moment. What does a man become when his primary preoccupation shifts from survival to sustenance? The line between the two is thin, perhaps imperceptible, but the psychological weight is immense. The wounded posed their own terrible mathematics. The medical officer, working in conditions that would have horrified surgeons in any hospital, did what could be done with morphine in short supply, bandages that were washed and reused, and an inventory of instruments that had to serve far more casualties than any surgeon's training had prepared him for. Infection was nearly as deadly as shrapnel. A wound that might have been treated routinely elsewhere became, in the siege, a slowly darkening sentence. Gangrenous limbs, wounds that drew flies despite all efforts at hygiene, in an environment where hygiene had become almost theoretical. The smell of the aid post mingled with rain and mud, and something else, the sweetish scent of decay that soldiers learned to recognize and dread. And yet, in the midst of this compression of suffering, something unexpected occurred. Perhaps it was gallows humor. Perhaps it was the peculiar magic of men thrown together in extremity. Perhaps it was simply the human refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Somewhere near the center of the small garrison position stood something that would become, decades later, one of the most evocative symbols of the siege, a tennis court. Or what had once been a tennis court, belonging to the club where the British officers had kept some small semblance of peacetime society before the war consumed it entirely. The court had been used for various purposes since the outbreak of fighting. It served as a storage area. At times it was used as a casualty clearing ground. But what made it remarkable? What gave it a kind of legendary quality that historians and writers would return to again and again, was that despite everything, despite the rationing, despite the thirst, despite the constant gnawing proximity of death, some of the men who held that ridge found moments in which the tennis court became something else. It became a space of defiance, yes, but also of something more tender, of a refusal to let the siege define them entirely. Whether matches were actually played there, or whether soldiers simply sat on the lines of the court, during the rare quiet moments and allowed themselves to imagine such things, has become somewhat lost to the filtering of time and retelling. What matters, perhaps, is what that image came to mean. A tennis court is a space designed for leisure, for competition pursued without existential stakes, for the ordinary pleasure of exertion and skill, and the simple fact of being alive in a body that can move and reach and strike a ball across a net. In the context of a siege, the existence of such a space, used or imagined, becomes a profound statement. It is the human assertion that there are things worth remembering beyond survival, things worth preserving, even when everything else is being stripped away. The soldiers who held Kohima were not philosophers. They did not sit and meditate on the meaning of a tennis court, but they lived it. They moved through a world of thirst and hunger and fear and still, somehow, found a way to let their minds rest occasionally on something other than the next attack, the next casualty, the next day. That capacity, whether it manifested in actual games played to impossible odds, or in the quieter rebellion of sitting near an empty court and allowing the mind to wander into territory that the siege could not follow, that was perhaps the deepest resistance they could mount. Days blurred into one another. The sound of artillery became background, almost like weather. The rain came heavier, the mud deepened. Men rotated through trenches, through makeshift shelters, through the terrible calculus of trying to hold a few hundred yards of rocky ridge against an enemy that had them nearly surrounded. And somewhere in the middle of all this, ordinary things persisted. A soldier would notice, with a clarity born of deprivation, that the light at sunset had a particular quality. Another would receive a letter that had made its way through impossible supply lines, and would read it so many times that the paper became soft and the ink began to blur. Another would find a moment with a comrade to laugh at something that, in any other context, would have been mundane or invisible. This was daily life inside the siege. Not the siege as the history books would come to describe it, but the siege as it was lived, minute by minute, hour by hour. A compression of scarcity and small acts of grace. A space where men learned what they could endure and discovered, to their own surprise, reserves of resilience that they did not know they possessed. On April 9, 1944, as the siege tightened around Kohima Ridge and supplies dwindled to almost nothing, the battle took on a character that would define the entire campaign. The Japanese 58th Regiment, having secured positions on the lower slopes of the garrison, began pressing inward with a desperation born of hunger and the weight of impossible orders. The defending British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers found themselves compressed into smaller and smaller spaces, their perimeter shrinking day by day until what had been a sprawling defensive line became something far more intimate and terrible, a matter of yards, then feet, then the distance between one trench and another. It was at this point that the tennis court, that small, flattened rectangle carved into the ridge by the British in peacetime, became the focus of some of the fiercest hand-to-hand combat of the entire Pacific and Asian theatres. The court sat between the district commissioner's bungalow and the deputy commissioner's residence, two stone structures that had become mutilated strongpoints, their windows widened into firing ports, their walls scarred by shrapnel and bullet strikes. The tennis court itself offered little natural cover, but it commanded several approaches to the garrison's central position, and so it became a necessity to hold it, no matter the cost. What followed was not a single moment of combat, but rather a series of assaults and counter-assaults that spanned several days, each one bleeding into the next, in the memory of those who survived. The Japanese would attack from the west and north, moving through what had once been residential gardens, now churned into mud and ash. The defending soldiers, a mixture of British officers and NCOs, Indian sepoys from the Assam Regiment, and Gurkha riflemen whose mountaineering skills and savage melee combat training made them particularly formidable in close quarters, would repel them with rifle fire, grenades, and bayonets, then fall back to the tennis court's edge or the trenches dug around it. Between waves there would be an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the wounded calling out and the occasional sniper's shot. Then the Japanese would come again. The ground around the tennis court became a landscape of its own, not a place of recreation anymore, but a compressed kill zone where every inch was purchased with lives. The baseline, the net posts, even the smooth surface of the court itself, became reference points in a desperate geography that soldiers on both sides would, for the rest of their lives, find impossible to fully convey. How do you describe the exact angle of approach where you last saw your closest friend? How do you explain to someone who was not there why a tennis court mattered more than cities? The British and Indian soldiers, aware that they were holding the line not just for themselves but for the entire hope of relieving Imphal, fought with a grim resolve. They rationed their remaining ammunition, directing fire with the discipline of men who understood that each shot needed to count. When Japanese soldiers reached the court's perimeter, there was no room for hesitation or mercy. The Gurkhas in particular became known, in whispered accounts from both sides, for the ferocity of their hand-to-hand defense. Their kukris, the curved Himalayan blades that had become almost legendary in martial reputation, were employed with a precision and speed that left the Japanese deeply wary of too close approaches. Yet the Japanese attackers, themselves hardened by jungle warfare and driven by a cultural code that made surrender unthinkable, pressed forward regardless. They understood they were dying, but perhaps they had internalized the notion that their deaths had meaning, that they were purchasing something with their blood. It is important to pause here and acknowledge what the historical record cannot fully capture. We have memoirs and official accounts, we have letters written in those moments between attacks, we have the measured testimonies of those who lived through it and spoke to historians decades later. But the actual sensation of fear, the way exhaustion and hunger compound to make coherent thought nearly impossible, the particular loneliness of knowing that help is distant and your supplies are running out, these remain, in some way, locked inside the experience itself. What we can say with certainty is that the tennis court changed hands multiple times. British and Indian soldiers would hold it, then be forced to withdraw. Japanese soldiers would advance onto it, and then be driven back by counterattack. This repetition, this grinding back and forth, is characteristic of siege warfare at its most terrible. One account, recorded by Captain John Winstanley of the Assam Regiment, describes a moment when the tennis court was held by perhaps a dozen British soldiers and twice that number of Indian soldiers, facing repeated charges from the Japanese 58th. Winstanley, then a young officer, remembered the peculiar silence that fell after one particularly fierce assault, when both sides seemed to realize that they had lost so many men that a renewed attack would likely break through the defenders' line. In that silence, a Japanese officer, his uniform torn, blood visible on his shoulder, stood at the far edge of the court and simply watched. Winstanley watched back. For perhaps 30 seconds, the two men looked at each other across that small, devastated rectangle. Then the Japanese officer bowed, very slightly, and withdrew. It was not surrender, it was perhaps acknowledgement. Within hours, he would likely be back with reinforcements, but in that moment, there had been something else, a recognition, perhaps, of shared exhaustion and mutual awareness of the terrible symmetry of their situation. The technical details of the tennis court's defense are recorded in various official histories and unit records. There was a defensive trench system dug around it. Sections of the net had been removed to allow for clearer lines of fire. The boundary lines of the court served as reference points for artillery spotters in the rear positions. Ammunition had to be rationed so severely that each man knew precisely how many rounds he had and was expected to account for any he fired. The dead were buried in shallow graves in what had once been the flower gardens of the commissioner's compound. Between the attacks, soldiers attempted repairs to the trenches, shored up sandbags, and tried to get water when the occasional precious container could be spared. The defenders' supply situation during the tennis court phase of the battle was dire. By the second week of the siege, rice rations had been cut to barely 2 ounces per man per day. Bully beef tins were stretched across meals, and the men grew gaunt quite visibly, their strength sapped by hunger even as they were required to perform the most physically demanding and psychologically crushing work of warfare. Thirst became as much an enemy as the Japanese. The water supply had to be rationed with the same severity as food, and the monsoon rains, which would have provided relief, had not yet arrived. This physical degradation added a layer of unreality to the fighting. Men reported, in later accounts, experiencing moments of dissociation, not fear, but something closer to a kind of waking dream, where their bodies moved and fought while their minds seemed to be observing from a distance. And yet the line held. Why did the tennis court matter so much? Partly because it was the linchpin of the garrison's central position, partly because it was visible, it could be seen from multiple command posts, and its loss would be, symbolically and strategically, a collapse, but also, perhaps, because it was so absurd that it became sacred. In the midst of such terrible circumstance, to hold a tennis court became an act almost of defiance against the reduction of human beings to tactical calculations. To say, "We held the place where people once played," that meant something. For a moment, amid all the death and hunger and noise, it meant something. In the chaos and confinement of siege, men become more themselves, not less. Their names surface in letters tucked into tunics, in diary entries scratched by candlelight, in the half-remembered conversations of survivors who carried their stories decades forward. Consider Lance Corporal John Harmon, a British soldier whose particular courage during those early days of siege would become almost mythic in the retelling. Harmon was not a career officer or a celebrated commander. He was a rifleman of the 4th Royal West Kent Regiment, a man of medium height, with a quiet, deliberate manner that suggested someone accustomed to listening more than speaking. In the first chaotic moments when the Japanese encirclement tightened around Kohima Ridge, Harmon found himself exposed in a trench on the perimeter as waves of Japanese soldiers pressed forward through the darkness. The accounts suggest he remained at his post through several waves of assault, his rifle fire steady and methodical, seemingly indifferent to the storm of return fire around him. Those who survived alongside him would later describe something almost mechanical in his focus, as if fear had been replaced by an absolute clarity of purpose. What drove such steadiness in the face of certain death remains the quiet territory of each man's inner life, but in letters he wrote, fragments that survive, there is no rhetoric of heroism, only a simple acceptance that some things must be done because they are necessary. On the Indian side, consider Major Yashwant Girinath Desai of the 4th Royal Indian Army Service Corps, a man born in Western India who would spend much of the siege coordinating the desperate logistics of keeping the garrison supplied. Desai's letters home reveal a mind constantly preoccupied with mathematics. How many men, how little food, how many more days until resupply. There is something almost tender in his concern for the health of soldiers under his care, a kind of mathematical compassion in which he calculated not just calories, but dignity. In one passage, quoted in military records, he notes the peculiar problem of trying to maintain morale when the men could actually see Japanese soldiers moving through the perimeter. He writes of the importance of hot water for tea, as if this modest warmth was a form of spiritual resistance against the encroaching cold and darkness. Did he understand his role as quietly heroic, or did he simply understand it as necessary? The distinction may be smaller than we imagine. The Gurkha soldiers present their own particular portrait. These were men from Nepal, brought into the British Army through long tradition, and among those at Kohima were soldiers of the 4th Battalion, the 7th Rajput Regiment, and units of the Gurkha Rifles. Their correspondence, when it exists, often speaks to a kind of inherited stoicism, a cultural understanding of duty that carried different weight than it might for British soldiers. Consider the perspective of a young Gurkha rifleman, call him Ram Bahadur, though many soldiers shared that name, who had been recruited in his early 20s and found himself now holding a ridge in Burma, far from the green valleys of his homeland. The letters that come down to us, filtered through translation and military archives, suggest less anxiety about death than about the shame of abandoning one's position. There is a phrase that recurs, in various forms, across accounts of Gurkha soldiers at Kohima. The idea that to retreat was to lose something more precious than life itself. Whether this reflects a cultural reality or the romantic memory of British soldiers who survived alongside them remains genuinely uncertain, but the pattern suggests something true about how these men approached their predicament. On the opposite side of no man's land, the Japanese soldiers faced their own particular agonies, though their voices reach us far more fragmentarily. The Japanese 31st Division, and particularly the units under General Sato's direct command, were experiencing the grinding reality of an offensive that had outrun its supply lines. Letters and accounts from captured or surrendering Japanese soldiers reveal a different kind of despair than that experienced by the besieged garrison. The British and Indian troops, though hungry and isolated, understood themselves as holding ground against an advancing force. The Japanese soldiers, by contrast, found themselves pushing forward into a vacuum, their supplies increasingly theoretical, their officers' orders seemingly disconnected from the physical reality of the terrain and the enemy's capacity to resist. In fragments of letters and unit diaries that survived the war, there emerges a picture of men who had been told they were advancing triumphantly toward India, and instead found themselves in a grinding stalemate against enemies who seemed to have inexhaustible ammunition and supplies. One captured Japanese officer, in a brief interrogation report, expressed something close to bewilderment that the British would commit so many resources to defending a small ridge in an obscure corner of the empire. Did he understand that Kohima had become precisely the point upon which the larger war was turning? Probably not. Like most soldiers, he understood only the immediate, the visible, the immediate threat before him. There exists a curious moment in the archives, one that speaks to the peculiar way that individual human beings persist, even in the machinery of total war. A letter was found after the battle, believed to have been written by a Japanese officer, preparing for what he knew might be his last assault. The author, his identity now uncertain, wrote of his family in Tokyo, of a daughter he had not seen in 3 years, and expressed something that transcends the usual categories of military accounts, a simple, human longing for the war to end. He does not write of defeat or victory in the letter's fragments we possess, but only of weariness and a kind of homesick ache that suggests that beneath the uniforms and insignias, men everywhere experience the same fundamental vulnerabilities. Whether the letter was ever sent, whether the officer who wrote it survived or died in the jungle, whether it was authentic or a later fabrication, matters less perhaps than what its existence suggests about how individual consciousness persists, even in the vast machinery of collective violence. The British officers at Kohima had their own particular styles of coping with the siege. Colonel Hugh Richards, the commanding officer of the garrison, was a man of Indian Army background whose earlier experiences in Burma had given him a certain hardened composure. His official reports are models of military restraint, yet in the private correspondence that occasionally surfaces, letters to his wife, brief notes to fellow officers, there emerges a picture of a man deeply aware that he was overseeing what could easily become a catastrophic loss. How does one command when the outcome seems substantially beyond one's control? How does one maintain the fiction of command when the situation is genuinely desperate? Richards appears to have resolved this through an almost theatrical commitment to routine. He would ensure that the officers still conducted themselves with the forms of discipline and decorum that suggested the siege was merely an inconvenience, rather than potentially fatal. There is something touching in this, a kind of refusal to surrender to despair that itself becomes a form of courage. The Indian soldiers, who made up a substantial portion of the garrison, bring yet another dimension to this portrait. Many were career soldiers of the Indian Army, a force that would become the Indian National Army following independence. Their letters and accounts are often characterized by a particular kind of irony. They understood themselves to be defending the positions of the British Empire against Japanese invasion, while simultaneously being conscious that they were likely serving an imperial project that was already dying. Some of these men would, after the war, move into independent struggle against the very forces they had defended at Kohima. Does this contradiction diminish their sacrifice? The question sits uncomfortably in the historical record. Their courage at Kohima was genuine. Their awareness that they were defending an empire that would soon dissolve was equally genuine. These two truths coexist without resolution. Among the more poignant collections of accounts are those from the medical personnel, the doctors, and orderlies who worked in the makeshift dressing stations throughout the siege. The testimony of Captain Jack Gibson, the senior medical officer, speaks to the particular horror of treating wound after wound with dwindling supplies. His later recollections suggest a man haunted less by the violence he witnessed than by the impossibility of alleviating suffering. He wrote, years after the war, that he would have dreams in which he was trying to bandage wounds with materials that turned to water in his hands, a metaphor perhaps for the futility of his position. And yet, the same records suggest that Gibson and his orderlies maintained a hospital, such as it was, where the wounded were treated with gentleness and what resources could be managed. Is it not possible that gentleness, in the face of overwhelming horror, is itself a form of profound resistance? What emerges from these portraits, taken together, is not a singular narrative of heroism, but something more complex and more human. These were men drawn from across the British Empire, from Britain itself, from India, from Nepal, and they found themselves compressed into a small area of contested ground, where, for several weeks, their individual fates became impossibly entangled with grand historical movements they barely comprehended. Each carried into the siege his own fears, his own letters from home, his own private understanding of what he was fighting for and whether it mattered. The Japanese soldiers on the opposing ridges carried identical burdens in different uniforms. And in the fragmented record that remains, the letters, the diaries, the testimonies collected years after, we catch glimpses of how ordinary consciousness persists even in extraordinary circumstances. What happens when a garrison surrounded on all sides loses the ability to feed itself, to heal its wounded, to fire at an enemy, drawing ever closer through the jungle? History offers us a particular answer from Kohima, one written not in grand strategy, but in the precarious arc of falling supplies and the courage of men who pushed exhausted aircraft beyond their design limits. By the third week of April, as the siege tightened and Japanese shells began landing inside the perimeter, the British garrison faced a calculation that had become grimly familiar by 1944. The ground was lost. No relief column could punch through for days, perhaps longer, and the stores of ammunition, medical supplies, and food were measured not in weeks but in days that could be counted on two hands. The only lifeline left was the sky. The only salvation lay in persuading the Royal Air Force to do something that remained, even then, far from routine. To drop supplies into a shrinking circle of men who held a ridge that the Japanese had already half surrounded. The responsibility fell largely to the RAF's No. 31 Squadron, operating from Assam with their aging twin-engine transport aircraft, the twin-boom Lockheed Hudson, and the slightly more modern Dakota, the Douglas DC-3, that had become the workhorse of the war in that theatre. Picture, if you will, these pilots and their crews gathering in the humid pre-dawn of an Assam airfield, studying maps that showed not landing zones, but rather a contested ridge, where accuracy meant the difference between survival and starvation, between hope and despair. The Japanese held the lower slopes, the British held the ridge. The margin between them was measured in hundreds of yards, sometimes less. The mechanics of an airdrop sound, perhaps, deceptively simple when described in words. But consider the reality as it unfolded above Kohima. An aircraft would climb to perhaps 500 or 600 feet, trading the security of altitude for the precision needed to deliver supplies into a small, crowded defensive position. At that height, a man with a rifle below could reach you, could damage you, could kill you. The Japanese knew this. They had guns in the hills. And so each drop became a moment of acute vulnerability, a window of exposure that lasted mere minutes, but felt, to those inside the aircraft, like an eternity compressed into breath and seconds. The supplies themselves were bundled into canvas bags, sometimes parachutes attached, sometimes not, depending on what was being dropped. Ammunition, desperately needed, fell in small boxes that could withstand impact. Tinned rations, medical supplies including morphine and bandages, water in jerry cans because thirst had become as killing an enemy as any bullet. These were parceled up in what weight and balance allowed, and then, as the aircraft descended into the target zone, men crouched in the fuselage doors with their hands on the packages, waiting for the signal, watching the ground rise toward them, the ridge becoming distinct, becoming real. One cannot tell the story of these drops without acknowledging a certain quality of chance embedded in every sortie. The garrison below would light signal fires, would wave panels of cloth to mark safe ground, but the perspective from 500 feet is not the perspective of a man on the ground. What seemed like open space to a pilot straining against the wind and his instruments might be mined or prepared with anti-personnel stakes. A parachute might drift. Even a few seconds of wind could carry it across the perimeter, into Japanese hands, or into terrain where retrieving it meant exposing yourself to sniper fire. And yet these drops happened repeatedly, day after day, in weather that ranged from clear and dangerous to overcast and equally dangerous. The RAF flew these missions with a stoicism that goes often unmentioned in accounts of the siege. There is something worth contemplating in the rhythm of these supply runs, in what they represented not merely as military logistics, but as an act of commitment. A garrison could break. A garrison could decide that the cost of holding ground had become too high, that surrender was preferable to dying of thirst or hunger or infection. But a garrison that received supplies, that saw aircraft return again and again despite the risk, that watched parachutes bloom above their heads with food and ammunition, that garrison received something more valuable than the contents of the packages themselves. They received a message. Someone, somewhere, had decided that you mattered, that you would not be abandoned, that your death, should it come, would not come as an afterthought, but as part of something that others deemed worth preserving. The pilots understood this, even if they did not speak it aloud. Squadron leader Stan Turner, who flew many of these missions himself, would later reflect on the peculiar intimacy of operations at such low altitude and such high stakes. You could see the men below, you could see them waving, see them running to collect the packages, see them crouch as Japanese fire broke out. You were not abstract, you were not distant, you were participating in an immediate, visible transaction between the sky and the earth, between safety and danger, between those who could help and those who desperately needed helping. How many sorties were flown to Kohima during the siege itself? The figure is somewhere between 600 and 700 individual drops, though the exact count remains, like so many details of this battle, slightly obscured by the passage of time and the fragmentary nature of wartime records. What matters more than precision is the pattern. Planes came. Day after day they came, in monsoon rain and clearing sunshine, with cargo that was never quite enough, but always enough to sustain the garrison one more day, one more week, until the 2nd British Division could fight its way through the Japanese lines and break the siege with living soldiers rather than with supplies falling from the sky. And yet there was a cost to this fragile lifeline that is worth acknowledging. Not every aircraft returned. Engines failed in the heat and humidity of Assam. Mechanical failure brought planes down on approaches to Kohima. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, sporadic but persistent, took its toll. Crews died maintaining this connection between garrison and supply, between hope and the material means of survival. Their names are less famous than the names of those who fought on the ridge, but their contribution was no less essential. For what is a siege without supply? What is a siege that is slowly fed, slowly sustained, until the moment when the besiegers themselves must face the choice between perseverance and retreat? This was the question that hung over Kohima as April turned toward May. The British and Indian forces in the garrison had been sustained. Their resistance had not wavered, would not waver. And somewhere in the calculus of war, Japanese commanders were beginning to understand that this particular ridge, this particular position, was becoming too costly to maintain. that the reinforcements they needed were not arriving, that the plan to sweep toward India was unraveling not in a single dramatic moment, but across many days of attrition, disease, and a supply situation that had only grown worse as supply runs from the air had proven so effective at keeping the British alive. By the end of May, as the siege entered its third week, and the defenders of Kohima Ridge had grown gaunt on their rationed biscuits and tins of bully beef, something shifted in the rhythm of the guns. The Japanese, who had seemed so unstoppable in their encirclement, began to feel the first tremors of their own supply lines breaking down. General Sato had driven his divisions across jungle and mountain with ruthless efficiency, but he had driven them almost to the point of dissolution. Ammunition was counted in rounds per gun, food had become a memory, and very far to the south, across those same tortured hills, a British relief column was pushing northward with a ferocity born of desperation. The 2nd British Division, under Major General Grover, had begun its march from the plains of Assam as soon as the news of Kohima's encirclement became clear. This was not a fresh, rested force. These were men already depleted by garrison duty in the heat, their uniforms hanging loose, their feet already blistered from months of training and movement. But they carried with them something perhaps more valuable than numbers, the absolute certainty that they were marching to save their countrymen, and that uncertainty about whether they would arrive in time had sharpened every officer's resolve into a kind of terrible clarity. The road they travelled wound through the same mountains that had swallowed the Japanese columns, but in reverse. Where the Japanese had pushed up and inward toward the siege lines, the British were pushing up and inward against them. The landscape reshaped itself day by day as they climbed. The monsoon was gathering now in the valleys, turning the tracks into streams, and it was in this half-liquid world of mud and hanging mist that the 2nd Division began to encounter Japanese rearguards who had no intention of letting them through. Around the village of Milestone 109, the 1st Queen's Own Royal Regiment made contact with elements of the Japanese force blocking the road. This was not the main defensive line. The bulk of the Japanese army was still thrown around Kohima Ridge itself, but it was a determined presence nonetheless. Men who were themselves starving and sick took positions in hastily prepared trenches and fought with the bitter knowledge that if they gave ground, the very garrison they were starving would be relieved. The mathematics of warfare, in its cold way, dictated that these men should fight harder, precisely because they were losing. What followed was a series of grinding engagements that, to the men involved, felt almost like siege warfare in miniature. Each hilltop position had to be taken by force. Each mile of the road was contested. The Japanese would fall back, dig in on the next ridge, and force the British and Indian battalions to deploy, reconnoiter, attack, and consolidate. There was no rush possible, only a grim, measured, methodical advance, and yet within this slowness there was an urgency that manifested as a kind of controlled fury. Soldiers who had been stationary for months in garrison suddenly found themselves in open combat, their blood moving faster than they had thought possible, their minds narrowed to the singular focus of driving forward. By the evening of June 2nd, the 2nd Division's forward units had fought their way within sight of Kohima Ridge. The defenders on the ridge, who had endured now for nearly a month of bombardment and encirclement, heard the sounds of fresh artillery opening up from the south and west. At first it seemed almost impossible, a phantom hope, a sound that perhaps their exhausted minds had conjured. But the firing continued, methodical and purposeful, working its way through the Japanese positions like a surgeon's knife. Supply drops had become more frequent as the airfield at Dimapur brought them within closer range, and now here came the ground relief, punctuated by the arrival of the RAF, whose bombers and fighters began to appear overhead with increasing frequency. The actual breakthrough came as something more than a single moment, something less than a watershed. The Japanese, who had been slowly weakening under the combined pressure of siege and counter-siege, began to realize that their encirclement was itself being encircled. From their positions around Kohima Ridge, from the hills to the south and southwest, they could hear the roar of engines and the crash of artillery that belonged to no unit they could relieve or reinforce. General Sato, who had proven himself an aggressive and determined commander, but also a realist, faced a choice that commanders rarely face with any comfort: continue to hemorrhage men in positions that could no longer be held, or order a withdrawal that would dishonor the officers above him and likely result in his own military disgrace. The corridor of advance that the 2nd Division was forcing open was narrow and precarious. Japanese strongpoints continued to resist fiercely, and some positions required days of fighting to overcome. The British were aware, with the particular kind of awareness that comes only in real time, that they might yet arrive too late. The garrison on the ridge, though reinforced now by the arrival of fresh supplies and, more importantly, fresh ammunition, was not yet safe. A single well-coordinated Japanese counterattack, if it could somehow be organized, might still overwhelm them. But the arithmetic of war was no longer in the Japanese favor, and with each passing day, it became clearer. What happened in the days that followed was not a glorious breakthrough, so much as a grinding inevitability. The 2nd Division, supported by Indian battalions and smaller combat groups drawn from throughout the garrison, began to methodically retake the hills that surrounded Kohima Ridge. Garrison Hill, which had been held by the besieged in a shrinking perimeter, was reinforced. GPT Ridge, critical to the defense of the ridge complex, was cleared of its Japanese positions through a series of small unit attacks that seemed to stretch across entire days and nights. Each hilltop, when retaken, revealed the extraordinary cost of the siege: trenches filled with shell casings, makeshift graves, the detritus of weeks of intense fighting compressed into small, vital pieces of earth. The psychological turning point, perhaps, came not with a single engagement, but with a recognition that spread through the starving garrison like a quiet dawn. The siege, which had seemed eternal, was ending. The Japanese were not breaking through, the reinforcements were not being stopped. And though there was still fighting to be done, terrible fighting, fighting that would last for weeks, the fundamental question of whether Kohima would hold or fall had been answered. It would hold, and in that holding, something larger than the battle itself began to shift. There is a peculiar habit in military history, one that emerges quietly when we speak of the most brutal confrontations between great powers. We reach for Stalingrad. The name itself carries weight, as though it has become the measure by which all other sieges must be judged. But in doing so, we often overlook a battle fought in the same year, in a place whose very geography seemed designed to inflict suffering, a battle where the mathematics of attrition warfare were written not in urban rubble and factory buildings, but in sodden earth, dense jungle, and the exposed stone of a windswept ridge in northeastern India. The comparison, though rarely made in popular memory, reveals something profound about warfare itself. Stalingrad, that scarred Soviet city on the Volga, became synonymous with urban destruction. Block by block, street by street, room by room, German and Soviet forces pulverized each other across a landscape of concrete and steel that had been systematically reduced to rubble. The entire city became a weapon. The rubble itself offered concealment, created natural fortifications, transformed every alleyway into a killing ground where visibility might extend only yards. Stalingrad was brutalism made literal. The sheer mass of the city and the countless buildings provided infinite defensive positions. For the attackers, each building meant house-to-house combat, hand-to-hand struggle. For the defenders, the urban maze offered terrible advantages against overwhelming numbers. Yet Kohima, though separated from Stalingrad by thousands of miles, operated under curiously similar principles. Consider the tennis court for a moment. That single, mundane sporting ground became, in the hands of defenders, something as significant as any fortress wall. The Japanese faced essentially the same problem that confronted German soldiers in Stalingrad. The terrain itself, rather than being an open killing field, offered hidden advantages to those who held the high ground. The jungle provided concealment. The ridge provided elevation. The scattered buildings and bunkers, crude though they were, offered strong points that had to be taken one by one. And just as in Stalingrad, progress could be measured in yards rather than miles. Both sieges, when examined closely, speak to a shared and almost mechanical form of warfare. In both cases, an attacking force found itself unable to translate superior numbers into swift victory. In both cases, the defenders, though often facing encirclement and starvation, possessed psychological and tactical advantages that slowly wore down the attackers. The breakdown was similar too. Supply lines stretched, communication faltered, reinforcement became agonizingly slow. At Stalingrad, the Germans depended on supply convoys across the frozen steppe. At Kohima, the British and Indian garrison depended on airdrops that often missed their intended targets or were scattered across contested ground. Yet there was a crucial difference in the character of the terrain itself. Stalingrad's urban density created a particular kind of horror, the knowledge that civilians had once lived in these buildings, that German soldiers were now sleeping in the rubble of apartment houses, that snipers could wait in windows overlooking the same streets where children had once played. There was an almost obscene intimacy to it, a violation of domestic space. Kohima, by contrast, was never urban in that sense. The battle was not over a city's soul, but over a ridge. The Naga villages that dotted the landscape were small, dispersed, and though they would be devastated by the fighting, they were never the object of the struggle in the way that Stalingrad was. What unified both battles, however, was the terrible mathematics of attrition warfare. In both cases, the engagement became a grinding test not of strategy or brilliance, but of supply and endurance. Who could sustain losses longer? Who could maintain morale when reinforcement seemed to be coming, but never quite arriving in sufficient numbers? Who could function on reduced rations, corrupted water, and the constant proximity to disease and death? The Japanese at Kohima, like the Germans at Stalingrad, found themselves in a battle where victory had become impossible, but retreat was forbidden or impossible to execute. Both armies poured men into the maw of the engagement, knowing that tactical victory or defeat had become secondary to the brutal fact of attrition itself. There is something historically quiet about this comparison, perhaps because it challenges certain comfortable narratives. Stalingrad has been mythologized in both Russian and Western memory as the turning point, the moment when German invincibility was revealed as illusion. It is a European battle, remembered extensively in European and American historical consciousness. Kohima, though equally a turning point in the Far Eastern War, has been absorbed differently by memory. It is sometimes called, accurately, the Stalingrad of the East, yet the epithet, rather than elevating Kohima in collective memory, seems to diminish it by rendering it secondary, a pale echo of an original. Yet consider what this comparison actually reveals. Both were siege battles. Both were fought in 1942 and 1944 respectively. The German siege of Stalingrad lasted roughly 5 months, from August to February. The Japanese siege of Kohima lasted roughly 2 weeks of intense fighting, but 2 months of investment. Both involved forces that were exhausted, far from home, and unsure whether relief would arrive in time. Both produced moments of extraordinary individual courage and terrible brutality. Both saw commanders grapple with impossible decisions, and both altered the trajectory of their respective theaters of war, though in different ways. The Japanese commander, General Sato, would find himself in a position not entirely unlike that of General Paulus at Stalingrad. Like Paulus, Sato received orders that became increasingly disconnected from the reality of his situation. He was told to hold Kohima and push on to Imphal, but his supply lines were failing. His men were weakening. Relief from higher command seemed increasingly unlikely, but unlike Paulus, Sato would eventually make the choice to retreat, understanding that further resistance served no purpose. It was, in its way, a more humane decision, though it came at tremendous cost to those who were ordered to make the crossing back to the Chindwin River. What both battles share, ultimately, is the demonstration of a principle that military theorists had understood, but that these battles made visible in the bleakest possible way. That modern warfare, when fought at the highest intensity between similarly equipped and motivated forces, becomes less a test of tactical brilliance and more a test of organizational capacity, supply management, and the capacity of soldiers to function under extreme deprivation. The individual soldier matters less than the system. The brilliant commander matters less than the quartermasters and the logistics officers working far from the sound of gunfire. Neither Stalingrad nor Kohima was won by a single brilliant maneuver. Both were won by the side that could absorb more punishment, maintain supply more reliably, and reinforce more effectively. And perhaps this is why both battles, though fought thousands of miles apart and in entirely different landscapes, speak to something universal about warfare, at the point where it becomes mechanized and industrialized, something exhausting, grinding, and ultimately more about the capacity to endure than the capacity to innovate or inspire. And then, in mid-May, as the siege hardened around Kohima Ridge and the fighting settled into its grinding, attrition-measured rhythm, the sky began to shift. The monsoon, which had been threatening at the edge of the Naga Hills like an approaching army itself, finally broke across the plateau. The first rains came not as gentle showers, but as something almost deliberate in their weight and their persistence. They fell in sheets that obliterated visibility beyond a few yards, turning the red earth into something closer to clay, closer to blood, closer to the very substance of suffering that would mark those remaining weeks. The terrain that had already been difficult, steep, carved into ridges and gullies by generations of monsoon rains long before this battle, became something almost impossibly hostile. Trenches that soldiers and sappers had dug with such effort and bloodshed began to collapse into themselves. The rifle pits that had provided shelter transformed into shallow pools of cold water and mud. Men stood in waterlogged positions for hours, unable to rest their weight fully, unable to dry themselves, their boots rotting on their feet, while the cold seeped upward through the clay. The bandages that wrapped wounds became sodden, useless. The field dressings that medical orderlies had so carefully applied would separate from skin, slick with rain and sweat, and the constant dampness that seemed to invade everything. The Japanese, who had arrived at Kohima expecting a swift breakthrough and supplies from the captured garrison, found themselves increasingly trapped by the very weather that had defined this landscape for millennia. Their supply lines, already stretched impossibly thin, became entirely dependent on what few porters and carriers could navigate the turn-to-mud mountain paths. Ammunition grew heavier in the wet. Food, always scarce, became even more difficult to distribute. The rice rations that soldiers tried to cook in makeshift fires that the rain kept extinguishing would often simply wash away in the downpour before anyone could eat them. One might wonder what those men thought during those cold nights, sitting in trenches that seemed to generate moisture from within themselves. Did they think of their homes? Of the promise of victory that their commanders had spoken of only weeks before? For the British and Indian defenders clustered on the ridge, the monsoon brought a different kind of crisis. The airfield at Imphal, from which RAF transport aircraft were attempting to fly supplies into the besieged garrison, became increasingly unusable. The planes that did manage to take off and navigate the obscured mountain passes, visibility sometimes reduced to mere meters by the rain and the clouds that settled into every valley, had to drop their supplies from increasingly uncertain altitudes and trajectories. Crates of ammunition, of water purification tablets, of morphine and bandages would sometimes miss the contested perimeter entirely. Other drops, aimed carefully at the defensive positions, would land instead in areas controlled by the Japanese, or would break open as they fell, their contents scattering across mud-slicked ground where they could not be retrieved. There emerged, during those monsoon weeks, a disease that seemed almost as much a participant in the siege as the artillery and the rifles themselves. Dysentery spread through both armies with a speed that military hygiene, already compromised by the constant fighting and the lack of clean water, could not contain. Men who had survived multiple attacks, who had held their positions against overwhelming odds, found themselves incapacitated, not by bullets, but by the simple biological fact of bodies crowded into wet, unsanitary conditions with minimal medical provisions. The British and Indian forces had access to a small field hospital and medical supplies, inadequate though they were. The Japanese, increasingly isolated, had almost nothing. Malaria, which had been a background threat throughout the campaign, accelerated in the wet. Soldiers developed fever dreams in their muddy trenches. Their skin took on a papery quality. Their eyes began to look hollow in a way that suggested the fever was burning through reserves that could not be replenished. The mud itself became a form of enemy that perhaps no one had fully anticipated. It was not the dramatic, story-filled enemy of gunfire and grenades. It was slower and more comprehensive. Vehicles that had been useful for moving supplies became stuck within hours of the monsoon's full arrival. Men had to walk ammunition and food and water forward by hand, often through terrain that had become so saturated that each step forward required a conscious effort to extract a boot from the earth's grip. In some areas of the defensive perimeter, the mud became so deep that carrying wounded back to the medical positions became a process measured not in minutes, but in agonizing hours. Litter bearers would sometimes sink to their knees, struggling forward with an injured comrade while the rain fell ceaselessly around them. The question of how a human body continues to function under such conditions becomes almost abstract. There is no answer that feels adequate. The Royal Air Force pilots who flew those supply runs during the monsoon, many of them young men themselves, perhaps only a few years older than the soldiers they were attempting to sustain, demonstrated a particular kind of courage that has perhaps been overshadowed by the more visible heroism of those on the ground. They flew through conditions that made navigation nearly impossible, following landmarks they could barely see, dropping supplies they could not accurately aim at targets they could not clearly observe. Several aircraft were lost during this period, disappeared into the clouds and the rain, their crews presumed lost over the mountainous terrain where recovery would be impossible. The impact of these losses rippled through the Kohima garrison, where each aircraft that failed to return meant food that would not arrive, ammunition that would not be resupplied, wounded that could not be evacuated. As the weeks of May progressed into early June, as the monsoon's intensity rather than abated, a grinding attrition set in that was perhaps more demoralizing than the sharp violence of the early battles. The siege was no longer a dramatic confrontation, but rather a slow, wet process of deterioration. Men on both sides grew weaker. The soil beneath them grew heavier. The air itself, thick with moisture and the smell of decay and human waste, and smoking fires that refused to burn properly, seemed almost to have weight. The Naga Hills, which had seemed so austere and clean and high when the battle began, had become something almost primordial, transformed by the monsoon into a landscape of mist and mud and the constant hiss of falling water, a landscape where human concerns seemed to shrink to their most fundamental level, the next breath, the next moment of shelter, the possibility that the rains might, eventually, stop. In the months before the battle came to Kohima Ridge, long before the encirclement and the siege, there moved through the Naga Hills a people whose names would rarely appear in the official dispatches, whose contributions would be measured in exhaustion rather than medals, in miles walked rather than enemy killed. The Naga peoples had inhabited these hills for centuries, living in their villages with their own rhythms, their own understanding of the forests and the mountain passes. They knew the terrain in a way no outsider ever could. They understood which paths would hold firm in the monsoon. They knew where water could be found when the streams ran dry. They carried within them a kind of knowledge that was almost geological, as if the hills themselves had taught them their secrets, generation by generation. When the armies came, first the Japanese moving north and east through the jungle, then the British and Indian forces scrambling to fortify the ridge, the Naga peoples found themselves drawn into a conflict that had originated in the boardrooms and strategy tables of distant empires. There was little choice in the matter. The war had come to their homeland, and survival meant adaptation. Young men and women began to serve as guides for the Allied forces, threading the small party through the dense vegetation and over the steeper slopes. following pathways that existed more in memory than on any map. Without these guides, the British and Indian soldiers would have been almost entirely lost in the jungle maze of the Naga Hills. The terrain was not forgiving of mistakes. A wrong turn meant hours of backtracking, or sometimes worse. A lost patrol in the jungle could become a lost patrol forever. Beyond the guides came the porters, thousands of them, moving up and down the supply lines that connected Kohima to the rear areas, carrying ammunition and food and medical supplies on their backs, often under fire. The British forces depended utterly on these supply chains. The garrisoned troops could not survive on what could be parachuted in or brought by air. The porters moved along the trails with their loads, working largely unseen by history, their labor the invisible foundation upon which the defense of Kohima was built. Some were conscripted. Some volunteered, understanding that the outcome of the battle might determine whether their villages would remain under British administration or fall under Japanese occupation. The choice between occupation powers was, for many, a question with no good answer, but the work remained necessary. It is worth pausing here to consider what it meant for the Naga peoples to witness this collision of empires on their own territory. The villages around Kohima had their own social structures, their own hierarchies and traditions. A young man from a village might be asked to guide a patrol, and in doing so, he might encounter Japanese soldiers who did not regard the Naga peoples as civilian non-combatants. There were moments of brutal treatment. There were villages that were burned. There were families that were displaced, caught between advancing armies with nowhere to go that felt genuinely safe. The Naga Hills became a theatre of war, and like all theatres of war, they were transformed by violence and loss. The porters who carried supplies into the siege, what did they see when they reached the ridge? They would have witnessed the devastation of what had once been a small, organized hill station. They saw British and Indian soldiers who were thin with hunger and exhaustion. They saw the Japanese positions on the surrounding heights, the constant threat of sniper fire and artillery. Some of the porters were killed in this work, some were wounded, some simply disappeared into the fighting, their fates recorded nowhere. The official casualty counts from the Battle of Kohima focus on British and Indian losses, on Japanese losses, on the military accounting of the conflict. But the Naga porters and guides suffered as well, and their suffering was less often documented, less often remembered in the grand histories that were written in the decades afterward. What is perhaps most striking is the question of what the Naga peoples themselves thought about the battle as it raged around them. Did they understand the strategic significance of Kohima? Did they grasp that this ridge, in some sense, represented the limit of Japanese ambition to march into India? Some among them certainly did. Others may have experienced it more simply as chaos and danger, as the collapse of their normal world into something chaotic and frightening. A village elder, for instance, might have reflected on how the wars of distant powers had suddenly arrived at his doorstep, how young men from his village were now risking their lives to serve as guides and porters for an army that might not even remember their names when the fighting was over. There is a particular kind of invisibility that attends the experience of non-combatants in military history. When we think of the great battles, we tend to think of the soldiers on both sides, the clash of armies, the strategic decisions made by commanders. But running beneath every battle is this other current, the civilians who are drawn in, who provide labor and service, who suffer collateral damage, who lose homes and loved ones in the chaos. The Naga peoples were not soldiers in this war. They were not the ones who made the decisions that led to the battle. Yet they were absolutely essential to the outcome, and the outcome affected them directly. Their homeland had become a landscape of trenches and barbed wire. Their forests had been cleared for defensive positions. Their villages had been evacuated or occupied. The life they had known was interrupted, and it would not fully return even after the Japanese were forced to retreat. Some historical accounts from the period mention specific Naga individuals who became known for their bravery or their exceptional service as guides. Others speak more generally of the contributions of the Naga Labor Corps, acknowledging their role without dwelling on their individual humanity or their particular experiences. There is often an asymmetry in how history is recorded. The actions of soldiers are documented in detail, while the actions of those who support them are noted more briefly, more secondarily. Yet the support was real, the labor was real, the risk was real. As the battle progressed, as the siege deepened and the fighting became more intense, the Naga peoples who lived in the surrounding villages had to make difficult choices about where to go, how to survive, what to do with their families and their possessions. Some fled further into the hills, some stayed and tried to maintain their lives amid the fighting. Some joined the portering efforts, deciding that service to the British was the safest available option. Others chose differently. The Naga Hills in 1944 became a place of uncertainty and constant danger, and the people who lived there bore the burden of that uncertainty alongside the soldiers who were fighting for control of the ridge. What strikes the observer, looking back from a distance of 8 decades, is how completely the story of Kohima can be told without mentioning the Naga peoples at all, and how many of the most detailed accounts do precisely that. The battle is framed as a contest between the Japanese army and the British and Indian forces, and the landscape is treated almost as a neutral stage upon which this contest unfolds. But it was not a neutral stage. It was inhabited. It was home. The Naga peoples were not merely the backdrop to the battle. They were witnesses and participants, and their presence in the story, however quiet it may have remained in the historical record, was absolutely necessary to everything that followed. Their guides made the movement of supplies possible. Their labor kept the garrison supplied. Their knowledge of the terrain shaped the strategy of defense. And their suffering, largely unrecorded and uncompensated, was part of the true cost of the battle that would eventually be called the Stalingrad of the East. By late May, the rhythm of the siege had begun to shift, though no soldier inside Kohima Ridge could yet perceive the slow turning of fortune's wheel. The Japanese were weakening. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the mountains. Their ammunition counted in dozens of rounds per gun rather than hundreds. Their men growing hollow-eyed and fevered as dysentery and scrub typhus moved through their positions as surely as the monsoon rain. And yet they held the high ground with a grip that seemed unbreakable, fortified not by elaborate defensive works but by the sheer weight of their determination and the terrain itself, which had become as much their ally as their enemy. The British 2nd Division, under Major General John Grover, had begun its advance from Dimapur, with deliberate, grinding momentum. They did not race. They could not afford to. Every ridge held Japanese defenders. Every saddle and every draw between the hills harbored machine gun posts, and mortar teams dug in with the resignation of men who had already accepted they might not leave the mountains alive. The British advance was methodical, almost ritualistic in its slow progression, sending reconnaissance patrols to probe the enemy positions, calling down artillery to soften the ground ahead, allowing infantrymen to move forward in careful waves, each unit leapfrogging the last, each battalion commander calculating the cost in lives against the bare yards of terrain to be gained. To understand this advance, one must hold in mind the peculiar horror of jungle fighting in that region. It was not the grand operational maneuver of desert warfare or the sweeping tactical gestures of European campaigns. This was intimate, exhausting, nearly blind combat. The Japanese defenders could often see only 30 or 40 yards ahead through the vegetation and mist. The British attackers advanced through that same suffocating green, uncertain whether the next ridge held one enemy soldier or 50. Grenades seemed louder in the jungle, more vicious somehow, their blast confined and concentrated by the dense foliage. Mortars fell from the sky without warning, the trees above occasionally adding splinters and branches to the already lethal shrapnel. The first significant objective was Garrison Hill itself, where the original British garrison, now reinforced and resupplied after weeks of isolation, held a precarious defensive position. The Japanese had attempted for nearly 3 weeks to dislodge them, but General Sato, for all his tactical acumen, could not sustain the kind of concentrated assault required to overwhelm entrenched defenders with superior firepower. As the British 2nd Division approached from the south and southwest, The pressure on the Japanese positions intensified. The relief force would need to break the encirclement, and Garrison Hill was the natural fulcrum upon which the entire siege would turn. The fighting for the immediate approaches to Garrison Hill was extraordinarily fierce in those last days of May and first week of June. Machine gun fire from both sides tattooed the ridge constantly. The sound became a background hum, a white noise of combat that men's ears eventually learned to filter unless a particular burst came close enough to command individual attention. The Japanese had prepared interlocking fields of fire across the main approaches. They had weeks to study the terrain and position their guns, and British attackers found themselves caught in crossfire more than once, forced to dig in and wait for artillery support or close air support from the RAF to suppress the enemy guns long enough for a renewed assault. But the British possessed something increasingly critical as June advanced: supplies, reinforcements, and the ability to rotate exhausted units to the rear. The Japanese could replace neither soldiers nor ammunition. General Sato, now certain that his higher commanders had abandoned any hope of taking Imphal and that his division faced slow annihilation in the mountains, faced an agonizing dilemma: obey the orders to hold Kohima until the bitter end, or acknowledge that continued resistance was merely a form of suicide and begin the retreat that would preserve at least some of his remaining men. The capture of Garrison Hill came gradually, rather than in a single dramatic breakthrough. As British pressure mounted and Japanese reserves dwindled, the defenders of Kohima Ridge began to lose the outlying positions. The perimeter contracted like a living thing, drawing in upon itself to conserve warmth and energy. By early June, the direct siege of Garrison Hill had effectively ended, as the British presence grew strong enough that encirclement was no longer possible. Japanese forces that had held the ridge began to slip away northward, not in organized retreat, but in exhausted withdrawals under cover of darkness and fog. The landscape of Kohima, once you could examine it in daylight without immediate fear of sniper fire, was a study in concentrated destruction. Every tree near the Japanese positions bore the marks of shrapnel and small arms fire. The ground was scarred with shell holes and entrenchments. The few buildings that had existed before the battle had become rubble and ash. Yet the ridge itself remained, unchanging and indifferent, exactly as it had been for thousands of years before the empires came and brought their wars to these remote mountains. As British units moved forward through June, they encountered a landscape that had been utterly transformed by weeks of siege warfare. What had been a quiet collection of villages and gardens and terraced fields now resembled a fragment of the First World War pulled forward in time. Endless trenches, wire obstacles, abandoned equipment, and the smell of death hanging in the monsoon humidity. They retook GPT Ridge, which lay to the east of Garrison Hill, clearing it position by position, sometimes advancing only 50 yards in a day's hard fighting. The Japanese defenders, knowing their situation was hopeless, chose to fight rather than surrender, largely because surrender seemed to offer only the prospect of captivity in a foreign land, far from home and honor. The advance became a procession through grief. British and Indian soldiers moving forward through terrain that had become sacred through blood and suffering discovered the small memorials left by their comrades, names scratched on wooden crosses, messages left in rubber ground sheets or cloth, the personal possessions of the dead, arranged with a certain respectful intention by whoever had been too exhausted to bury them. The psychological weight of retaking ground that had been so bitterly contested was immense. To move through the same positions where men had fallen weeks earlier, to see the traces of their final moments still visible on the ground and in the trees, created a peculiar kind of reverence among the advancing troops. This was not the exhilaration of a breakthrough or the satisfaction of a grand tactical victory. This was the slow, heavy work of consolidation and recovery. The Japanese retreat, when it finally came in earnest, was not a neat military withdrawal. It was chaos tempered by discipline, hunger, and desperation. Units that had held the ridge for nearly 2 months began moving north and west toward the Chindwin River, the same river they had crossed months earlier with such confidence and such high hopes. The journey back would be far more terrible than the journey in, for now they were retreating through mountains controlled entirely by the British and their allies, moving through terrain that had been stripped of any possibility of supply or rest. How might soldiers endure a journey of more than 100 miles through hostile territory with depleted ammunition, minimal food, and tropical diseases already ravaging their bodies? The answer, one must imagine, is that most did not endure it. Most simply stopped walking at some point and lay down. Their war ended not in glory or defeat, but in the simple cessation of effort that comes when the body can no longer answer the mind's commands. The retaking of Kohima Ridge proceeded through June with this grim inevitability. The British advance, though cautious and carefully sustained, was essentially meeting no organized resistance after the first week of the month. What they were doing instead was occupying territory that had been bloodily contested and was now being abandoned by defenders too weak to hold it any longer. They were also consolidating and preparing, because despite the apparent victory, no one knew how quickly or how far the Japanese would retreat, and the possibility of a renewed Japanese offensive, however unlikely it seemed, could not be entirely dismissed. By the middle of June, after exactly 4 weeks of siege, after more than a month of nearly continuous combat in conditions that transformed healthy men into hollow shadows of themselves, Kohima Ridge was fully in British hands again. The siege had been broken. The relief force had arrived, and the survivors on both sides, the ones who would remember the mountains and the mist and the constant drumming of gunfire for the rest of their lives, began the slow work of comprehending what they had endured and what it might have meant. What the men inside the Kohima garrison could not fully comprehend, even as supply drops became less frequent and the siege deepened week by week, was the magnitude of suffering unfolding just beyond their perimeter, in the thinning ranks of the Japanese soldiers who had marched so confidently across the Chindwin mere weeks before. The 31st Division, which had begun its campaign with the certainty of conquest, was collapsing not under a sudden barrage of concentrated firepower, but under something slower, more insidious, more absolute, the simple and terrible fact that there was almost nothing left to eat. General Sato had brought his men to Kohima on the promise that supply lines would hold, that reinforcements would arrive, that the strategic necessity of taking this ridge and the road beyond it would justify the risks. But no promise, no matter how sincerely made or how firmly believed in Tokyo, could manufacture rice across mountains choked with monsoon mud and hostile jungle. The supply problem that had plagued Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia reached its terrible crescendo in the hills around Kohima. A soldier's ration, in those final weeks of March and into April, had dwindled from the meager to the almost ghostly. Where once they had received, at minimum, the basic daily allowance, soldiers now scraped by on a handful of rice grain, on boiled leaves, on bark stripped from trees, on anything that could be chewed and swallowed and theoretically converted to energy for limbs that no longer believed in the possibility of victory. Consider what hunger does to a man over days. Over weeks, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a fog that settles over the mind before it settles over the body. Decisions that once seemed clear, orders that once seemed reasonable, begin to fracture under the weight of thirst and stomach pain and the simple awareness that the body is consuming itself. Men began to collapse, not during assaults, but while standing guard. Men hallucinated. Men walked toward the enemy lines not out of courage, but out of a kind of somnolent confusion, seeking water from places where they knew water could not be found. The Japanese soldiers around Kohima were not defeated by the rifles and grenades of the British and Indian forces, though those were present and deadly. They were being defeated by absence, by the absence of supply, by the absence of hope that it would arrive, by the absence of anything in the stomach to convert to the strength needed to hold a ridge that seemed, with each passing hour, less and less like a foothold on the path to India and more like a mass grave that had simply not yet closed. And it was here, in these circumstances of mounting desperation, that General Sato became a figure of defiance that must have seemed, to many of his superiors in Tokyo and in Burma, almost incomprehensible. For as the weeks progressed, and the British 2nd Division began its relief operations, and the encirclement tightened, and the casualty lists lengthened with names of men who would never read their own names on those lists, Sato became convinced of a truth that his commanders in the rear could not, or would not accept. The battle was lost. Not metaphorically, not strategically, not in some subtle sense, but lost in the most immediate and urgent sense. The men were starving. They could not hold indefinitely. Continued resistance would mean not a glorious last stand, but simply a more prolonged agony, a more complete annihilation of the 31st Division. What did Sato do with this conviction? He disobeyed, and not quietly, not in some indirect or deniable way, but with a clarity that must have shocked the headquarters staff who received his communications. He declared his intention to withdraw his forces across the Chindwin. He began, against direct orders from his superiors, to pull his units back from positions they had held at such cost. The disobedience of a Japanese general in the Imperial Army. This was something unprecedented. The culture of unquestioning obedience that had been drilled into every officer, every soldier, the sense that orders from above were not suggestions but divine mandates to be followed unto death itself. This was the foundation upon which the entire command structure rested. To violate it was to violate something sacred, yet Sato violated it because he had seen what his superiors, safe in their headquarters and confident in their maps and their grand strategies, had refused to see. He had seen the men. He had walked among soldiers who could no longer lift their rifles, who wept from hunger, who looked at their general with a kind of blank exhaustion that no amount of exhortation about the emperor's will could penetrate. Was Sato a broken man? There is something in the historical record that suggests he was, yes, broken by the impossible mathematics of war, by the clash between orders and mercy, by the knowledge that he could save some portion of his army only by defying the very system that defined him as a soldier. The decision to retreat was not made in a moment. It unfolded over the latter weeks of April, as the British noose tightened, and the monsoon clouds gathered, and the pathways through the Naga hills that the Japanese had climbed with such effort became the only possible routes for escape. And what a retreat it was! Not the organized withdrawal of a force that has decided to regroup and fight elsewhere, but a dissolution, a running away, a stumbling descent through mud and rain and fever and thirst, down paths where every step brought men closer to the rivers they must cross, and further from the graves of the comrades they were leaving behind. Think on this for a moment. How different the narrative of a battle becomes when you follow it to the end, when you do not stop at the moment of victory, but continue into the grief and the loss and the impossible choices that come after. The men who withdrew from Kohima, the survivors of the 31st Division, would remember not the opening glory of an offensive into India, but this: the hunger, the fever, the sound of rain on leaves, the awareness that they were going home defeated, that their sacrifice had not purchased anything but pain. How must it have felt to be one of those men, trudging down a hillside in the dark, knowing that behind you lay the bones of friends, and ahead lay only the river and the long walk home. By the middle of July, the Japanese offensive, that grand ambition of conquest stretching toward India, had begun its slow, terrible unraveling. General Sato's 31st Division found itself not advancing but retreating, not with the discipline of a planned withdrawal, but with the stumbling desperation of an army that had begun to dissolve from within. The ridge they had fought for with such ferocity was slipping away, not because of a single catastrophic blow, but because the mathematics of survival had become impossible. Ammunition stores dwindled to almost nothing. The supply lines that never really existed had finally stopped existing altogether. The men were starving. What unfolded across the early monsoon weeks was less a military retreat and more a slow human tragedy, measured in footfalls and fever, in the weight of exhaustion, in the quiet moment when a soldier realizes he may not reach home at all. The Chindwin River, which had been the jumping-off point for this offensive, that swift-flowing barrier between Burma and Assam, now represented something else entirely. It became an ending place, the final hurdle in a journey that had transformed from conquest into mere survival. The route back was the same path they had come, or rather, it was supposed to be. But monsoon rains had transformed the Naga Hills into something almost unrecognizable. Tracks that had been difficult became impassable. Streams became torrents. The jungle, which had seemed merely hostile during the offensive, now felt actively malevolent, a breathing, consuming thing that wanted nothing so much as to swallow these men whole and forget they had ever existed at all. One might ask, how much can the human body endure before it simply stops moving? The answer, it seemed, was something less than what these soldiers were forced to discover. The Japanese had abandoned the siege line on June 23rd, withdrawing from Kohima Ridge under cover of darkness. It was not a rout. The discipline held, the rear guard held, the wounded were carried as far as legs could carry them. But it was an acknowledgement that this particular dream of conquest had died, not in a single glorious moment, but through the slow, grinding attrition of supplies that never came and hope that had simply run out. General Sato, that austere and unyielding commander, had made his choice to withdraw, even as headquarters demanded he hold. He knew what his men's eyes could tell him, that they were no longer a fighting force. They were ghosts, keeping the shape of a division. The march itself became a descent into a different kind of warfare, one that the Japanese had not been trained for, and for which there was no honor to be found. Disease swept through the columns with the same inevitability as the monsoon. Dysentery, typhoid, dengue fever, malaria. These were not glorious enemies, but they were enemies nonetheless, and they moved through the ranks of weary men with terrible efficiency. A soldier would fall behind one day and be gone the next, abandoned not out of cruelty, but out of the simple mathematics of survival. To stop was to die. To wait was to condemn others. So the columns moved forward, and behind them they left graves without markers and bodies without names. Hunger became the constant companion. The rations, whatever they had been consumed long ago. Men ate bark. They ate grass. They ate insects. In some cases, it is recorded, though reluctantly spoken of even now, they ate what the dead no longer needed. The psychological toll of such hunger is something that becomes almost abstract to those who have never experienced it. The mind stops calculating probabilities and starts calculating only the distance to the next rest, the next chance to find something, anything, that might be edible. Historian Richard Lewin would later describe this phase of the campaign as perhaps the most devastating of any Japanese retreat in the entire Pacific War, and there were many such retreats by this point in 1944. The journey to the Chindwin, a distance that should have taken 10 days, sometimes took 3 weeks or more. Men died by the thousands. The exact number is contested by historians, and that very fact carries its own weight. When the toll becomes too massive to count with precision, something has been lost beyond mere arithmetic. Japanese records suggest perhaps 3,000 dead or dying during that retreat. Allied observers, watching from a distance, spoke of far higher numbers. What seems certain is that the 31st Division that would eventually recross the Chindwin bore almost no resemblance to the unit that had begun this offensive less than 2 months before. When those who survived did reach the river, they found it swollen by monsoon rains and far more formidable than it had been on the crossing into Assam. Engineering units, their numbers depleted to nothing, nonetheless constructed boats and rafts and pontoons from whatever materials remained. The crossing itself became another ordeal. Weak men, barely able to stand, were asked once more to muster strength they did not possess. Some drowned. Some simply sat on the banks and watched the water flow past, unable to summon the energy to reach the other side. The river took them as the jungle had taken the others, indifferent and absolute. Behind them, Kohima Ridge fell into silence. The monsoon rain continued its steady drumming on the ridgeline and in the abandoned trenches. British and Indian soldiers, exhausted themselves, moved cautiously forward to occupy positions still warm from their former enemies. They found abandoned equipment, scattered letters, photographs of homes so distant they might as well have existed on another planet entirely. They found evidence of a force that had been slowly, systematically ground to nothing, not in a blaze of battle, but in the cold mathematics of logistics and disease, and the relentless passage of time under impossible conditions. Did those who survived the retreat carry with them some permanent mark of those weeks crossing the Naga Hills? The question seems almost redundant. Men who have been to the very edge of starvation, who have watched comrades die of diseases they could not prevent, who have been abandoned by circumstance and distance, far from anything resembling home, such men carry that mark forever, whether visible or not. It becomes part of their breathing, their dreams, the way they listen for sounds in the darkness. Years later, some would speak of those weeks in careful, measured tones. Others would never speak of them at all. The withdrawal across the Chindwin was the end of an offensive and the beginning of a slow recognition, one that would spread through the Japanese military throughout the remainder of the war, that the strategy of conquest by bold assault was becoming untenable. The supply lines were too long. The empire was stretched too thin. And the human body, strong as it is, has limits. The Japanese had pressed against those limits and found them real. They had pressed against them and broken themselves against them, and the Chindwin River, flowing south with complete indifference to all human ambition, simply kept flowing as it always had and always would. When the last Japanese soldier crossed the Chindwin in late June of 1944, what remained on Kohima Ridge was silence, not the silence of peace, but the peculiar quietness that follows exhaustion so complete that even grief requires stillness to be felt. The ridge itself lay scarred with the evidence of 73 days of continuous bombardment and hand-to-hand combat. Burnt-out bunkers dotted the landscape like broken teeth. The tennis court, that strange and terrible place where men had grappled in the dirt and blood, was now simply a depression in the earth, already beginning to be reclaimed by the monsoon-fed grasses. In the weeks that followed the Japanese withdrawal, even as British and Indian units consolidated their positions and began the slow work of clearing the ridge, there emerged a different kind of labor altogether. Officers and men, many of them still bearing fresh wounds or the hollow-eyed exhaustion of those who had not slept properly in 2 months, began the gathering of their dead. It is one of those tasks that military histories often pass over quickly, yet it is perhaps the most essential of all. Row upon row, grave after grave, the fallen were committed to the earth of the ridge that had claimed them. Burial parties worked through the humid afternoons, marked by the sounds of earth being turned, and the occasional whispered prayer, sometimes offered by chaplains, sometimes by the soldiers themselves, words almost inaudible beneath the cicada song and the distant call of birds, returning to what humans had briefly rendered a wasteland. The British and Indian military authorities, recognizing perhaps that this place would carry weight in memory, made the decision to formalize what had been begun in those first raw days of mourning. They would establish a proper cemetery, a place that acknowledged not merely the logistics of interment, but the human requirement to honor those who had been lost. The location chosen was a terraced site not far from the garrison area, positioned so that its graves looked out across the same terrain that these men had contested with such ferocity. Here, row upon row of headstones began to rise, many bearing the simple inscription that was standard Commonwealth practice: name, rank, regiment, date of death. Many bore also a religious symbol, a cross for Christian soldiers, a crescent for Muslim, occasionally other faiths represented by smaller, quieter symbols. There were headstones, too, for men whose names were never recovered from the chaos of those weeks, marked simply with the words, "A soldier of the Second World War," or occasionally, for Indian soldiers, "known unto God." But it was one inscription in particular that would come to define the place, and in a strange way would become the voice of Kohima itself, speaking across decades to a world that had largely forgotten this distant ridge in Burma. On a stone set at the entrance to the cemetery, words were carved that had been chosen with evident care. words that seemed to have been distilled from the very letters and last testimonies that had survived those men. The inscription reads, "When you go home, tell them of us, and say, 'For your tomorrow, we gave our today.'" The voice in those words is peculiar and haunting. It is not the voice of institutional mourning. It does not speak in the language of duty accomplished or strategic victory achieved. Instead, it speaks directly across time and geography, from the dead to the living, from those who would not return to those who would. It is an act of speaking from beyond, and perhaps there is no more profound request than this: the request to be remembered not as a statistic or a name on a monument, but as a presence in the consciousness of those who go on living. It is worth pausing to consider what this epitaph accomplishes and why it has endured so powerfully in the memory of those who have read it. The inscription does not ask for pity. It does not demand that those who come after understand the precise particulars of the battle or its strategic significance. Rather, it asks something simpler and more universal. It asks to be held in memory. It acknowledges implicitly that the people at home, the mothers and wives and children and siblings, scattered across Britain and India and Nepal and all the far corners of an empire at war, will want to know what became of their sons and husbands and brothers. It honors that need, and in its restraint, in its refusal to sentimentalize or to make claims about glory or righteousness, it achieves a kind of eloquence that sentimental language might never reach. "We gave our today," it says, and in that simple statement rests an entire philosophy of sacrifice. Not sacrifice eagerly embraced, not sacrifice that felt glorious in the moment, but sacrifice understood as the necessary cost of allowing others to have tomorrows. The cemetery itself, as it developed and was formally established, became something quite distinct from the trenches and bunkers and shattered forest that surrounded it. It is a place of order. The headstones are arrayed in careful rows. The grass is maintained. There is a quietness there that seems almost artificial when set against the chaos of the memory of combat. Yet this order itself serves a purpose. It says, with the quiet authority of ritual, that the violence that happened here is now contained, now honored, now set apart. The cemetery becomes a space where grief can be organized, where remembrance can take specific form. For visitors who came in the years and decades after the war, perhaps family members who had lost someone on that ridge, the cemetery offered a place to direct their sorrow, to place flowers, to speak aloud names that might otherwise fade into the general amnesia of history. The construction of the cemetery, however, raised questions that were less easily resolved. Who among the dead would be included? The cemetery holds the graves of British soldiers, of course, men from the Devon Regiment, the Cameronians, the Assam Regiment, and others. It holds Indian soldiers from various units, men who had been recruited into the Indian Army and who had fought with courage and sacrifice equal to any. There are Sikh soldiers here, and Hindu soldiers, and Muslim soldiers. There are Gurkhas. It is, in its way, a microcosm of the armed forces of the British Empire at that moment in history. But the cemetery does not hold the graves of all those who died at Kohima. Japanese soldiers who fell on the ridge were buried separately, and the circumstances of their burial, and the degree to which their remains were recovered with the same care and respect, remains a more complicated chapter in the history of that place. This is not to suggest impropriety or disrespect, but rather to acknowledge that even in death, and even in the construction of memorials to the dead, we find ourselves situated within histories of enmity, of the distinctions that war creates between those who are buried with full honors and those who are not. The Naga peoples, too, who had lived on that ridge for generations, who had their villages overrun and their landscape transformed into a battlefield, whose own dead were not always recorded or honored in the formal ceremonies of the British and Indian armies. Their presence and their losses would form a kind of shadow history to the cemetery itself. Some Naga men had fought alongside the British as guides and soldiers. Some had served as porters and laborers. Some had simply watched as their world was violated by the armies of empires they did not choose to serve. For them, the cemetery at Kohima would hold a different meaning altogether, perhaps not a place of honor, but a marker of the moment when their homeland became a stage for others' conflicts. Over the decades since the end of the war, the cemetery has remained. It is maintained to this day by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, an organization devoted to the care of military cemeteries across the world, and in this maintenance, there is a kind of quiet statement as well. These graves are not abandoned. They are not forgotten by the institutions that authorized the wars that led to them. The Commission employs gardeners who tend the lawns, who repair headstones when weather or time degrades them, who ensure that the names remain legible. For the families of the dead, many of whom live far from Kohima and will never see the grave of their loved one in person, this maintenance offers a form of assurance. Across the decades and the changes of history, across the transformations of empires and the reordering of the world's political landscape, this place remains marked. This place remembers. And the epitaph itself, when you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today," has taken on a life beyond the cemetery. It has been quoted in books and documentaries, inscribed in museums, spoken aloud in memorial services. It has become a kind of universal statement about sacrifice in war, detached perhaps from its specific context, but carrying the weight of that context nonetheless. Soldiers in other wars, other conflicts, have found that these words spoke to their own experience of loss and danger. Veterans have wept when reading it, even those who had no personal connection to Kohima. There is something in the directness of that plea, the simple request to be remembered, that transcends the particular and touches something universal in human experience. Yet it is worth considering what gets lost in this universalization as well. In becoming a general statement about sacrifice, the epitaph risks losing its specificity, its particular location on a ridge in Burma in 1944, the specific circumstances of men from specific regiments facing an enemy under specific conditions. To remember Kohima only through the lens of a beautiful and affecting epitaph is, perhaps, to forget something essential about what happened there, the details of thirst and dysentery, and the desperate scramble for high ground, and the discovery that you can die from wounds that will take days to finally claim you. The cemetery is beautiful in its way, maintained and ordered and peaceful, but the battle was not beautiful. The battle was profane and terrible, and random in its destructiveness, as battles are. The cemetery honors the dead, but it cannot fully capture what it meant to be alive in that place during those 73 days. Still, for those who came after, the cemetery has offered something essential. It has offered a place where grief could be located, where memory could be anchored, where the names of the dead could be read aloud, and thus brought, temporarily, back into the world of the living. The epitaph on that stone has offered a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. It has said, across the gulf between the living and the dead, across the decades and the vast distance from that distant ridge to the homes where families waited and hoped and eventually accepted the silence that meant their husband or son or brother would not return. It has said that they are not forgotten. It has asked that they be remembered. And in the simple act of remembering, in visiting that cemetery and reading those names, and pausing to acknowledge what was lost there, visitors participate in fulfilling that request. They bring those voices back, if only temporarily, into the world. And yet, for nearly half a century after the war ended, Kohima slipped into a peculiar kind of silence in the Western imagination. The battle that had cost 15,000 lives, perhaps more if you count the Naga porters and civilian casualties lost to disease and displacement, was somehow absorbed into the larger narrative of the Pacific Campaign, filed away alongside 100 other ridgelines and jungle clearings that seemed, from a distance, to blur into one another. In London, in Washington, in the schoolrooms of Europe where the Second World War was taught, the focus fell elsewhere. Stalingrad itself had become the archetype of urban desperation, its rubble and street fighting seared into collective memory. The beaches of Normandy, the frozen waste of Russia's Western Front, the horror of the camps. These were the narratives that shaped how the war was remembered in the decades that followed. Kohima remained, by comparison, a footnote in a campaign that itself felt peripheral to the great European struggle. Part of this forgetting was simple geography. The Far Eastern Theatre, as it was sometimes called, existed on the far side of the world, from the Atlantic communities that would dominate the post-war cultural conversation. Newspaper readers in Britain and America had followed the campaigns in North Africa and Europe with a kind of intimate daily urgency. The Eighth Army in the desert, the advances into Sicily, the breakout from Normandy, these stories belonged to a familiar landscape of names and places that resonated in the European consciousness. But Burma, Northeast India, the Naga Hills, these were remote territories wrapped in the imagery of imperial geography and jungle warfare that seemed almost timeless in its remove. It was easier, perhaps, to forget what happened in places that had never quite felt real to the audiences back home. There was also, underlying this erasure, a more uncomfortable historical pattern. The battles of the Far East had been fought not only against a Japanese enemy, but within the machinery of empire itself. The Indian Army had played a vast and crucial role at Kohima, the 4th and 7th Indian Infantries, the 50th Parachute Brigade, the Sikh and Punjabi regiments whose soldiers had died in numbers that rivaled their British counterparts, yet whose names and regiments often disappeared into the aggregate statistics. The Gurkhas, too, had bled on those ridges, their incredible bravery somehow flattened into exotic reputation rather than really. Scene. When the war ended and Europe began to process its trauma and its triumph, the colonies themselves were being released, or released themselves, from imperial rule. The narratives of the Far Eastern campaign became entangled with the story of decolonization, and perhaps the Western powers found it easier to let those stories recede. They complicated the post-war order. They raised uncomfortable questions. The slow rediscovery of Kohima's true significance began, ironically, through the very communities that had been forgotten. In the 1960s and 1970s, as India asserted its independence and began to reckon with its own military history, separate from the British narrative, the battle began to be revisited in Indian historical writing. The fallen were honoured, the contribution of Indian regiments properly chronicled. Then, gradually, Western historians began to look again. Books appeared, scholarly works at first, then more popular histories, the British Eighth Army Association, the various regimental museums, the few surviving veterans who had begun to speak more openly about their experiences. All of these helped pull Kohima back into the light. What emerged from this rediscovery was a deeper understanding of something that had been there all along. Kohima was not secondary to the European War. It was not a lesser battle fought in a lesser theatre. It was, in many ways, more consequential than it had been given credit for. The failure of the Japanese to break through to India represented the absolute limit of Japanese expansion to the south and west. The holding of that ridge, the eventual repulsion of the Japanese army, had sealed the fate of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and the siege itself, the mathematics of attrition, the desperation, the sheer grinding horror of it, placed it genuinely alongside Stalingrad as one of the most brutal, most consequential battles of the entire war. Part of the rediscovery, too, involved a recognition of what Kohima had meant to those who fought there. The survivors who began to speak about it decades later, many of them quite elderly by then, spoke with a kind of reverence that suggested they had always known what the wider world had forgotten. They had carried the memory with them through all those years of relative silence. The Battle of Kohima was their battle. It had defined them, and when, in the 1990s and 2000s, dedicated memorials began to be erected, when ceremonies of remembrance were finally established at the gravesite itself, there was among the veterans a sense of something being restored, something that had been wrongfully diminished, finally being given its proper weight. The comparison with Stalingrad became more pronounced as historians examined both battles side by side. Here were two sieges, separated by geography and circumstance, yet animated by an almost identical logic. In both cases, a relatively small defending force had held a symbolic position against an aggressive, well-organized assault. In both cases, the battle had become not about the place itself, but about something larger, about will, about attrition, about which side had the capacity to endure just slightly longer than the other. In Stalingrad, it had been a Soviet city fighting for its name and its survival under the German boot. At Kohima, it had been a small British garrison, supplemented by Indian soldiers and local porters, defending a ridge in the jungle against the ambitions of the Japanese Empire. The scale was different. The urban geometry of Stalingrad's ruins provided a different kind of brutality than the muddy, disease-ridden trenches of a jungle ridge. And yet the essence was comparable. Two clashes of empires, two moments where exhaustion and courage and blind chance determined the direction of history. What is perhaps most striking about Kohima's journey from obscurity to rediscovery is what it reveals about how we choose to remember war itself. The narratives that survive in popular consciousness are not always the narratives of strategic importance. They are shaped by geography, by language, by the cultural proximity of the home audience to the place of combat. A battle in Europe gets retold more easily in European and American voices. A battle in Asia gets absorbed into different narratives, told in different languages, embedded in different historical traditions. For decades, there were essentially 2 memories of Kohima, one in the West, which was faint and fragmentary, and one in India and Burma, and among those who had been present, which was vivid and central. It is only in recent decades that these memories have begun to converge, that Western audiences have started to truly comprehend what Kohima meant. And in that convergence, there is perhaps a larger truth emerging. The Second World War was not merely a European war, nor was it even primarily a European war in terms of where the heaviest casualties fell, where the most desperate fighting occurred. The Far Eastern theatre, which had seemed for so long like a secondary concern, was in many ways the arena where the largest questions about power and dominion were being decided. Kohima, which had seemed for so long like a small battle on a ridge that few could even locate on a map, now appears in its proper proportion, as a turning point in human history, as a moment where the architecture of the post-war world was genuinely determined. The veterans who are left, now in their late 90s or beyond, carry with them the full weight of that understanding. They have seen their battle forgotten, then slowly remembered. They have seen a new generation of historians and students begin to take seriously what they lived through. Some of them have had the opportunity to return to Kohima, to walk the ground again, to stand at the memorials and witness their sacrifice being properly acknowledged. Others did not live long enough to see this recognition. But the rediscovery itself, the slow, patient work of historians and communities to pull Kohima from the shadows of history, represents something hopeful. It suggests that eventually, even the stories that are temporarily lost can be found again. Even the battles that fade from immediate consciousness can be restored to their rightful place. As the afternoon light grows thin and amber across the Kohima ridge, the way the shadows lengthen through the pine trees returns us, in a sense, to the beginning, to that moment before the storm, when mist gathered in the valleys, and the only sound was wind moving through the needles and the distant calls of birds. Decades have passed. The trenches have filled with earth, the blood has long since returned to soil, and yet something remains here, something that lives not in the ground itself, but in the quiet attention of those who come to remember. If you walk the ridge today, the monsoon clouds still gather in much the same way they did in that terrible summer of 1944. The air still hangs heavy and damp against your skin. The rain still falls with the same insistent rhythm, drumming on the leaves and streaming down the hillside in thin, urgent channels. Nothing essential has changed about the landscape. The ridge is still high, the valleys below are still green and deep, and perhaps that continuity, that refusal of the world to be transformed by human suffering, is itself a kind of mercy. In the war cemetery at Kohima, beneath the stone memorial, the inscription reads, "When you go home, tell them of us, and say, 'For your tomorrow, we gave our today.'" Those words were written by Kohima's commander, Colonel Hugh Richards, in the quiet aftermath, when the guns had fallen silent and there was space, at last, to think about meaning. And the extraordinary thing about that phrase is not its grandeur, but its intimacy. It does not demand that the world remember in grand terms. It asks only for a simple telling, a conversation, a passing along of knowledge from one person to another. Tell them of us. That is all. Those words, quietly spoken in the dusk of a distant place, carry a weight that does not diminish with time. They speak to something that soldiers on both sides of the battle seem to understand, that their sacrifice might fade from official histories, might be overshadowed by larger campaigns and more famous names, and that they might nonetheless matter, that the act of bearing witness to their struggle, of holding their memory gently in mind, might itself be a kind of honor. The British and Indian and Gurkha soldiers who held Kohima knew they might die. The Japanese soldiers who crossed the Chindwin and climbed the hills knew they had been sent on what many believed was a suicide mission. And yet they came anyway, drawn by duty, by fear, by the simple fact that they had been ordered to come, and soldiers obey. Neither army fought for ideology that day, whatever the distant capitals might have claimed. They fought for each other, for the man next to them in the trench, for the small chance of survival, for the possibility of going home. General Sato, the Japanese commander, refused an order to continue fighting after supplies ran out, understanding in the end that to demand further sacrifice from starving men would be murder, not warfare. There is something almost unbearably human in that moment of defiance, a senior officer choosing mercy over obedience, choosing to save lives even as his army was defeated. He would be court-martialed for it. History would largely forget it, but it happened. In the midst of brutality, a man drew a line. The Naga peoples who lived on and around that ridge witnessed all of this, the arrival of armies, the terrible violence, the rain falling for months on end, the slow transformation of their homeland into a place of military occupation and bloodshed. Many served the British forces, many guided soldiers through the jungle, many carried supplies, and many died in the crossfire or of disease. Their stories even less recorded than those of the uniformed soldiers, their sacrifice woven into the fabric of conflict without fanfare or memorial. If there is a loss greater than those we know, perhaps it is the one that was never counted, and yet the ridge has healed, the forests have grown back, the vines have crept across the old bunkers, the villages have been rebuilt. The people who live there now were born after the war, many of them decades after. For them, the battle is a story they have heard, something historical, something that happened to an older generation. That distance, that passage of time, is its own kind of mercy. It means the wound does not remain forever open. It means that places can be more than their worst moments. As dusk falls more deeply now, and the light turns that particular shade of blue-grey that comes just before true dark, the ridge settles into silence. The birds settle into their branches. The wind dies down. The air seems to hold its breath, the way it always does at this hour, as if the world is preparing for sleep, is gathering itself into rest. And in that quiet, there is something that feels almost like forgiveness. Not forgetting. Forgiveness and forgetting are not the same thing. The dead of Kohima are not forgotten, not by those who loved them, not by those who come to the cemetery to place flowers at the stones, not by those who read the names and try to imagine the lives behind them, but there is a way in which the ridge itself has accepted what happened there. The earth has accepted the blood. The stone has accepted the weight of names. The wind continues to move through the pines, indifferent and eternal, the way the world itself is indifferent to our dramas, even our most terrible ones. Perhaps that is what peace is, at its deepest level, not the absence of memory, but the integration of it. Not the erasure of suffering, but its placement within